The city skyline faded in Marcus's rearview mirror, like a dream he was choosing to forget. The towering glass buildings that had defined his existence for the past 6 years diminished with each passing mile, becoming smaller, less imposing, until they merged into a hazy silhouette against the autumn sky. Marcus kept his hands steady on the steering wheel, his knuckles white from gripping too tightly, as if holding on hard enough might anchor him to the person he used to be. Behind him lay the angular apartment on the 42nd floor, the one with floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked the city's beating heart. It was the kind of space that impressed people at parties, though the parties themselves had grown hollow and exhausting. He'd sold most of his furniture to a young couple who couldn't conceal their envy. They thought they were ascending into something magnificent. Marcus had simply felt like he was descending. The road curved gently as he left the metropolitan sprawl, and the landscape began its transformation. The concrete gave way to asphalt, the asphalt to rolling hills draped in October's amber and crimson. His phone sat silent on the passenger seat. No messages from the architecture firm, no urgent emails demanding his attention, no notifications about the Riverside development project he'd spent 18 months designing. He'd left all of that in the capable hands of people who didn't question whether ambition was the same thing as purpose. Marcus thought about Emma, as he had thought about her countless times over the past month. Her dark hair catching sunlight in the coffee shop where they'd met. The way she laughed with her whole body, unself-consciously, as if joy was something simple and attainable rather than something to be strategically pursued. When she'd finally asked him to come live in Millbrook, her small hometown nestled in the hills of western Massachusetts, he'd felt something shift inside his chest. It wasn't clarity exactly. It was more like standing at the edge of a cliff and finally accepting that the ground below might be soft. The decision to leave had seemed romantic in theory. Love conquers all. Follow your heart. All those platitudes that sounded profound at midnight when Emma was asleep beside him, her head on his chest, her breathing steady and trusting. But now, as the autumn day began its gentle fade toward evening, Marcus wasn't certain of anything. What if he was making a tremendous mistake? What if he'd constructed an elaborate fantasy around a woman he'd known for only 18 months, conflating infatuation with destiny? The architecture firm had offered him a partnership track. Partnership, the kind of success he'd worked toward since his first day as a junior designer, hungry and eager to prove himself in a world that didn't care about his hunger. And yet, when he'd sat in the glass conference room, watching the partners congratulate him with their bloodless smiles, all he could think about was the exhaustion in his own reflection. The way his shoulders hunched over his desk at 11 at night. The way he'd stopped noticing sunsets because they happened while he was in the office. The way he'd stopped noticing almost everything except the next deadline, the next project, the next rung on a ladder that seemed to extend infinitely upward into a sky he could never quite touch. Emma had offered him something different. Not success, certainly. Millbrook didn't have architecture projects. It had a population of 2,000 people who mostly knew each other's business and grew their own vegetables. It had quiet. It had space. It had her moving through her days with a calmness that seemed impossible to Marcus, impossible and utterly magnetic. The highway stretched ahead of him, winding through valleys where small towns twinkled in the gathering darkness. Soon he would arrive at Emma's cottage on the edge of the village, a place that smelled like cinnamon and old books, where she'd prepared a room for him and a drawer that was meant to be his. He didn't know if he was brave enough for this or just foolish. Perhaps those things were indistinguishable. He pressed forward on the winding highway, toward a woman he loved and a life he was terrified to begin. The village of Millbrook announced itself not with fanfare, but with the absence of sound. Marcus noticed it first as his car crested the final hill, where the sprawling metropolis he'd left behind finally surrendered to something else entirely. The city's constant murmur, sirens, voices, the relentless hum of 8 million lives pressing together, fell away gradually, replaced by a quietness so complete it felt almost like deafness. He rolled down his window on that cool autumn evening and heard nothing but wind moving through trees that were already half bare, their remaining leaves the color of burnt honey against a slate-gray sky. The main road through Millbrook stretched barely 2 miles, lined with brick storefronts that had weathered decades with the patience of things that knew no reason to rush. The bakery was closed. The general store's windows reflected only twilight. A single street lamp flickered to life as he passed, though he couldn't find another soul on the sidewalk to justify its illumination. It was only 6 o'clock, yet the village had already drawn its curtains and settled into something that resembled sleep. Marcus gripped the steering wheel tighter, feeling the first tendrils of doubt curl through his chest. Emma's cottage sat on the outskirts, where the village's modest buildings gradually gave way to the rolling farmland that defined this corner of the world. He'd seen photographs, but photographs couldn't capture the overwhelming smallness of it, the way the cottage seemed to huddle against the encroaching darkness like something vulnerable. Stone walls, a thatched roof, a garden where September's remaining flowers bowed their heads to the approaching cold. Smoke rose from the chimney in delicate wisps, and he found himself thinking that this cottage was real in a way the city apartment he'd vacated that morning could never be. Emma emerged before he'd even turned off the engine. She stood on the threshold, backlit by warm lamplight, and for a moment Marcus forgot to breathe. She was exactly as he remembered and somehow more vivid, as though the city had been slowly draining her from his memory in grayscale, and now he was seeing her in full color again. Her smile was tentative, acknowledging the weight of this moment, the irreversibility of his arrival. She wore a cream-colored sweater that made her look soft and settled, belonging to this place in a way he wasn't certain he ever would. He crossed to her slowly, and her embrace was warm and familiar, smelling of wood smoke and the lavender sachets she kept in her dresser. She held him longer than he expected, as though checking that he was truly here, that this wasn't another weekend visit that would end with him returning to his real life. His chin rested against her hair, and he tried to feel the certainty he'd promised himself he would feel upon arrival. Inside, the cottage wrapped around him with heat and comfort. Emma had prepared dinner, and they sat at her small wooden table while evening deepened into true night. She told him stories about the village, about the rhythms of small-town life that she'd been learning to love over the past year. She spoke of the baker who rose at 4 in the morning, of the way everyone knew everyone, of a community that held its members like cupped hands. She spoke with wonder and contentment, as though describing a world she'd been lucky enough to discover. Marcus listened and nodded and tried to mirror her enthusiasm, but something inside him resisted. The silence pressing against the cottage windows felt demanding, as though it wanted something from him he couldn't quite name. He'd given up the city's electricity and possibility for this woman he loved, for a life that suddenly seemed impossibly still after the motion that had always defined him. Emma seemed to sense his struggle. She reached across the table and squeezed his hand, not asking him to explain, not demanding he be anything other than uncertain. Later, they moved through the cottage's evening rituals, and Emma showed him to her bedroom where they would stay together starting now. She'd placed fresh lavender on the pillow and a glass of water on the nightstand, small kindnesses designed to ease his arrival. As darkness settled completely, Marcus lay beside Emma in her small cottage, listening to the unfamiliar symphony of rural night, crickets, distant wind, and his own uncertain heartbeat. Morning came not with the sound of traffic, but with the smell of hay and the distant call of a rooster. Marcus jolted awake, his heart racing as though an alarm had shattered the quiet. But there was no alarm. There was only the insistent cry of a bird somewhere beyond the cottage walls, followed by the gentle stirring of Emma beside him. She stretched languidly, unbothered by the interruption, while Marcus lay rigid, staring at the exposed wooden beams above her bed. In the city, mornings announced themselves with purpose. Car horns, delivery trucks rumbling down streets, the urgent beeping of crosswalk signals. Here, there was only nature, demanding to be acknowledged on its own schedule. He slipped out of bed quietly, padding across the cool wooden floors to the window. The village of Millbrook was already beginning its day. An elderly woman walked past with a basket of vegetables. A teenager on a bicycle waved at her as though they were old friends. Marcus realized they probably were. Everyone here seemed to know everyone, an awareness that had begun to press against him like an uncomfortable weight. By afternoon, the pressure had intensified into something closer to claustrophobia. Marcus ventured into the village alone, seeking coffee and something to eat. There was a small cafe called the Grain and Kettle, which closed at 5 in the afternoon. 5 o'clock. He checked his phone in disbelief. Back home, restaurants wouldn't even start their dinner service until 6. He managed to grab a sandwich just before the owner began wiping down tables with the finality of someone closing for the night. The lack of options became apparent everywhere he looked. No late-night pharmacy, no grocery store open past 7. The single gas station shut down at 9. He found himself standing in the middle of Main Street, a road so quiet it seemed like a stage set abandoned between scenes. In the city, this hour would be alive with possibility. Here, the streetlights flickered on as if signaling surrender to the approaching darkness. There was no public transportation. He discovered this when he asked a shopkeeper for directions to the train station. The woman had laughed kindly and explained that most residents either drove or relied on what she vaguely called the network. The network, he learned, was apparently just people knowing people and offering rides. The concept terrified him. His autonomy, something he'd taken for granted, now felt like a luxury he couldn't access. By evening, the sense of being observed had become overwhelming. At the small pub where he'd attempted to find dinner, the bartender knew his name. He'd only been introduced to her once, casually, through Emma. Yet she greeted him as though they were old acquaintances and immediately began asking questions about his background, his work, his intentions regarding Emma. The other patrons turned to listen with expressions of polite interest that felt distinctly uncomfortable. He wasn't being rude. They were being friendly. That was somehow worse. He thought about his apartment back in the city, where he could disappear into anonymity. He could walk past the same people 1,000 times without acknowledging them. He could order food at any hours. He could step outside at midnight and find 1,000 options for entertainment, sustenance, or simple distraction. The freedom of that isolation suddenly felt precious. The absence of noise troubled him too. Tonight, as darkness fell, the silence pressed in with an intensity that made his ears ring. In the city, silence never existed. Here, the quiet was so complete it felt like a living thing, something demanding his attention and challenging him to fill it. When he mentioned some of this to Emma over a simple dinner at her cottage, where she'd prepared everything from scratch because there was nowhere else to go, she simply smiled. She didn't seem to understand that he was drowning in charm, that every quaint detail of Millbrook felt like a constraint rather than a feature. Marcus returned to Emma's cottage, already mentally cataloging everything the village lacked. The bookstore smelled of aged paper, lavender sachets, and 100 stories waiting to be discovered. Emma's hand found Marcus's as she guided him through the narrow doorway, ducking slightly beneath the weathered wooden frame that had welcomed readers for nearly 40 years. Her fingers were warm, alive with anticipation, and he could feel the tremor of excitement running through her. The interior unfolded like a secret garden of literature. Shelves climbed toward cream-colored ceilings, crammed with volumes whose spines bore the soft fading of beloved books read many times over. Afternoon light filtered through wavy glass windows, casting everything in a honey-colored glow that felt almost sacred. A fireplace occupied one corner, its mantel decorated with framed photographs of the shop's history, black and white images showing the same storefront across different decades. Emma moved through the space with the reverence of a priestess in her temple. She knew exactly where everything lived, moving her fingers along spines as if they were old friends. Here was the local history section, where she had personally helped document the town's founding stories. There was the poetry corner, where Mrs. Henderson liked to sit on rainy afternoons. That worn leather armchair by the window had cradled countless readers seeking refuge from the world's complications. And this, Emma said, leading him to a small wooden desk tucked beneath a skylight, is where I spend my mornings when the store is closed. I catalog donations, research the town's genealogy, sometimes just sit here writing in my journal." She ran her hand along the desk's surface, and Marcus noticed how her shoulders seemed to relax in this space, as if the weight of everyday concerns simply couldn't penetrate these walls. Marcus wandered slowly through the aisles, trying to muster genuine enthusiasm. The books were well chosen, certainly. The shop was undeniably charming in that deliberately quaint way that rural places cultivated. But something in him resisted the pull of it all. This was exactly the kind of establishment that represented everything he had worked to escape. The small-town bookstore, the knowing glances from neighbors, the assumption that one's entire world could be contained within a single building, within a single community. He paused at a display of self-published memoirs from local authors. Emma appeared at his side, her voice soft with pride. These were stories that might never have found publication in the traditional world, stories that would have remained confined to kitchen tables and family archives. But here they were, displayed with the same care as any major publishing house release. There was something almost beautiful about that democratization of storytelling, he had to admit. "Almost every person who comes through that door has a story," Emma said, gazing around the space with such tender affection that Marcus felt a flutter of something uncomfortable in his chest. "Some people come in looking for a specific book, but what they really need is to be seen, to know that someone cares about their search. I've helped people find books that changed their lives. I've watched quiet souls discover they weren't alone in their struggles." Marcus nodded, understanding the words intellectually while feeling them slip away from genuine comprehension. This was Emma's world, her passion, the thing that made her eyes light up and her voice take on a musical quality. In the city, he had people too, but they were different. They were connected by ambition, by the constant pursuit of something larger, something that mattered on a broader stage. They weren't content to simply know each other, to tend to community like gardeners tending a small patch of earth. "I wanted to show you this," Emma continued, gesturing around the bookstore with both arms, "because it's the heart of who I am. This place, these people, these stories they carry with them. This is what I wake up for every morning." Emma's eyes sparkled with joy in her element, and Marcus felt the weight of her happiness pressing against his own lingering dissatisfaction. The project proposals coming through Marcus's laptop screen felt hollow, stripped of the urgency and innovation that once fueled his ambition. He sat at the small wooden desk in his rented cottage, the November afternoon light filtering through lace curtains that Emma had brought over weeks ago, casting delicate shadows across his workspace. 3 months had passed since he arrived in Millbrook, and the initial enchantment of small-town life had begun to fracture under the weight of professional stagnation. The work he found was modest at best. A local hardware store needed shelving redesigned. The community center wanted minor renovations to its meeting rooms. These were not the sorts of projects that once kept him awake at night with excitement, sketching possibilities until dawn broke over the city skyline. They were functional necessities, executed competently but without spark. Each completed proposal felt like filling out a tax form rather than creating something that would reshape how people moved through space. Marcus rubbed his temples and opened the video conference window for his third remote meeting of the week. His former colleagues appeared in small boxes on his screen, animated and energetic in the gleaming downtown office he once occupied. They were discussing a downtown waterfront district redesign, a project of such scale and complexity that it made his breath catch. The kind of work that required late nights with a team, whiteboard sessions that stretched until midnight, the collaborative friction that somehow produced brilliance. He watched them argue about sight lines and structural integrity, and his fingers itched to join the conversation. Instead, he muted his microphone and listened, a ghost haunting the margins of his old professional life. By the end of the meeting, his chest felt tight with longing. This was what he missed. Not necessarily the city itself, though he had loved its energy, but this specific alchemy of talented minds in motion, pushing each other toward excellence. That evening, he met Emma at the small cafe on Main Street. She was flushed with excitement about a client who had hired her to design a whole line of seasonal products. And she described her vision with such infectious enthusiasm that he found himself smiling despite his internal turmoil. But underneath her joy, he sensed something she had not explicitly said. She was building something here. Her roots were deepening into Millbrook's soil with each passing week. She belonged here in a way he was not sure he did. Later, back at his cottage, Marcus opened his email to find a message from his old mentor, Richard Chen. The subject line read simply, "We're building something extraordinary." Richard had written with an offer Marcus had expected but hoped might not come. A senior position at the firm, with a corner office and a team of younger architects to lead. Relocation assistance, a salary increase, everything that his ambitious younger self had dreamed of achieving by 30. Marcus read the message 3 times, each pass making the offer feel more real and more impossibly complicated. Richard had always believed in him, had pushed him to take greater risks, to pursue projects of consequence. "I know you're taking time for yourself," Richard wrote, "but I also know you, Marcus. You're not the kind of man who finds fulfillment in quiet corners. You need the challenge. You need the magnitude. Come back. We can do something remarkable together." The words both thrilled and terrified him, because Richard was right in ways that felt inconvenient. Marcus did thrive on challenge and collaboration and meaningful ambition, but that was the Marcus who existed in the city, who was slowly discovering that he might be a different person here in Millbrook, or perhaps a version of himself he had never had the chance to develop. He thought of Emma's sparkling eyes when she talked about her creative projects. He thought of the way the village felt in autumn, how the brick storefronts seemed to hold memories, how people actually knew his name. He thought of the quiet nights and the slowness that once felt suffocating, but now sometimes felt like freedom. Marcus leaned back in his chair, the tension in his shoulders mirroring the tension in his heart. The decision before him was not simply professional, it was existential, a fork in the road that would determine not just what he did for a living but who he was becoming. His old mentor's email sat open on his screen, a golden bridge back to everything he had abandoned. Saturday morning arrived with an invitation Marcus would have gladly declined if Emma hadn't already laced her fingers through his. The farmer's market opened at 8, and she'd been talking about it all week with the kind of enthusiasm that made his chest tighten in ways he couldn't quite name. He'd grown accustomed to declining such invitations, to retreating into the comfortable solitude of his apartment where the city felt distant and manageable. But Emma had a way of making refusal seem impossible. The market sprawled across the town square, a place he'd driven past dozens of times without really seeing it. Now, walking through with Emma's hand warm in his, he noticed everything. Canvas canopies in soft earth tones created a patchwork landscape. The air carried the scent of apples and fresh bread, of herbs he couldn't identify and soil still clinging to vegetables. Farmers stood behind their displays with genuine smiles, not the practiced expressions he remembered from vendors in the city. Emma pulled him toward a stall overflowing with autumn squash, their skins painted in shades of amber and deep orange. The woman behind the counter greeted Emma by name, asking about her mother's garden and whether she'd been using the heirloom tomato seeds from last year. Marcus watched this exchange with something like fascination. There was a continuity here, threads connecting people across seasons and years. They wandered further, Emma stopping to chat with almost everyone they encountered. She bought local honey, fresh bread still warm from someone's oven, bunches of dried flowers. Marcus found himself trailing behind, observing the patterns of community he'd never bothered to notice. A man in a worn Carhartt jacket stood near a truck bed laden with apples. His name was George, according to the handwritten sign above his produce, and he must have been nearly 80, with deep lines around his eyes that suggested decades of sunrise watching. When Emma introduced Marcus, something shifted in George's gaze. The old farmer studied him with an intensity that felt almost knowing, as though he could read the restlessness written into Marcus's shoulders, the doubt etched into the space between his brows. "Emma says you're from the city," George said, his voice like gravel settling. "That you're finding your way back to the quiet places." Marcus hadn't remembered Emma saying anything quite so poetic about his arrival, but he nodded anyway. George handed him an apple, a simple gesture that somehow felt significant. "This town's got stories," George continued, his attention drifting to organize apples that needed no organizing. "Not the kind you'll find online or in any book. The real kind. The kind you have to be still enough to hear." He glanced back at Marcus. "Most people come here and see a place that's stuck in time. But what if it's just a place that knows time doesn't have to move so fast to matter?" Emma squeezed Marcus's hand, and he realized she was smiling in that knowing way that suggested she'd orchestrated this conversation somehow. He didn't mind. Something about George's words had lodged themselves into his thoughts like seeds looking for soil. They bought more apples before leaving, and Marcus found himself asking about George's orchard, how long he'd been farming, whether he'd ever considered leaving. The old man's laugh was surprisingly warm. "Oh, I left once," George said. "Went to see what else was out there. Came back inside a year, realized everything I wanted was here all along." The drive back to Emma's house was quiet, contemplative. Marcus held the bag of apples in his lap, feeling their weight, their solidity. His phone buzzed with another email notification, probably his old mentor again, the golden bridge still extending toward his former life. He silenced it. That evening, Emma made pie from George's apples while Marcus read by the window. The kitchen filled with the scent of cinnamon and warm fruit. He found himself wondering about this place, about the invisible threads that held it together, about people who stayed. As he bit into the sweetest apple he'd ever tasted, Marcus wondered if there was more to this town than he had yet bothered to see. Dr. Henry Chen's clinic was modest, with waiting room chairs that didn't smell of industrial sanitizer and walls decorated with watercolors instead of corporate art. Marcus sat in one of those comfortable chairs, waiting for his appointment, watching the afternoon light filter through windows that overlooked the village green. He'd come in for a routine checkup, mostly because Elena had insisted during one of their morning encounters at the bakery, where she'd begun saving him a cinnamon roll without being asked. When Dr. Chen emerged from the back, Marcus was struck by the man's unhurried demeanor. There was no rushing, no glancing at watches or scheduling the next appointment before finishing with the current one. The doctor moved with the ease of someone who had made peace with time itself. "Marcus, good to see you, Doctor," Chen said, shaking his hand firmly. "How are you settling into Millbrook?" The question surprised him. Most doctors didn't ask about settling in. They asked about symptoms. As they moved through the examination, Dr. Chen continued to weave conversation naturally between listening to Marcus's heart and checking his reflexes. He asked about Marcus's work, about what brought him to this small corner of the world. "I was actually here by accident," Marcus found himself admitting. "Car trouble. I was passing through." Dr. Chen smiled knowingly. "That's what most people tell themselves at first, but I've found that accidents in small towns often feel less like chance and more like invitation." While washing his hands, the doctor began to share his own story without Marcus asking. He'd spent 15 years in Boston, working in a prestigious hospital, climbing the ladder of success with methodical precision. He'd had the corner office view, the six-figure salary, the recognition from peers. Then one autumn, his daughter had asked him why he missed her school play, and he realized he couldn't remember the last time he'd attended one. He couldn't remember, in fact, what color her eyes were without picturing a photograph. "I made a choice, Doctor," Chen said, turning back to face Marcus. "I came here and opened this clinic. People thought I was running away. Maybe I was for a while. But I wasn't running toward nothing. I was running toward something." Marcus listened as the doctor explained how different this work felt. Here, he knew his patients beyond their medical charts. He understood the context of their lives, the pressures they faced, the small victories that mattered to them. When he treated someone for injury or illness, he saw them recover and walk past his window the next week, waving hello. The impact was visible, tangible, real. The city teaches you to measure success in certain ways, Dr. Chen continued, settling behind his desk. But success is just a word. What matters is whether you're building something that matters to you, whether you're present for your own life. Marcus found himself asking questions he hadn't expected to ask. About the transition, about doubt, about whether the doctor ever missed the prestige. Dr. Chen answered with honesty that felt almost revolutionary in its simplicity. Yes, there were moments of uncertainty. No, the paycheck would never match what he'd earned before. But something else had grown in its place. A sense of purpose that didn't depend on external validation. The strange thing about small towns, Dr. Chen said as their appointment concluded, is that they strip away the noise. You can actually hear yourself think here. You can figure out what you actually want versus what you've been told to want. He walked Marcus to the door, and in that moment, Marcus noticed the framed photograph on the desk. A teenage girl with Dr. Chen's eyes, laughing at something just beyond the camera's view. The doctor caught his gaze and smiled. "My daughter's eyes are brown," he said simply. "I see them every day now." Walking out into the autumn air, Marcus carried the doctor's final words. Purpose doesn't have to be grand to be meaningful. When Emma casually mentioned the cottage's aging kitchen, Marcus felt the first stirrings of something that resembled purpose. They had been sitting on the front porch, watching leaves drift across the garden in lazy spirals, when she sighed and said the stove barely worked anymore and the counters were held together by habit and hope. Her voice carried no complaint, only wistfulness, as if describing something beautiful that had grown tired with time. Marcus found himself leaning forward. He asked about her vision, what she imagined when she closed her eyes and pictured the space she wanted. Emma laughed, surprised by his earnest interest, and began to describe small details. She wanted warmth, she said, light that poured across the workspace, room for baking, which she did on winter mornings, shelves that displayed the old blue pottery her grandmother had left her. Nothing expensive, nothing modern, just honest and functional and beautiful in the way old things could be. That night, Marcus returned to the cottage studio where he'd been staying and pulled out his old sketchbooks. The leather covers were weathered, the pages filled with designs from his former life in the city. Glass and steel, minimalist lines, impersonal spaces meant to impress rather than comfort. He set them aside and found fresh paper instead. This felt different somehow, more intimate. He started by researching the cottage's original era. Built in 1923, according to the property records Emma had mentioned. He visited the local historical society on Main Street, where Margaret, the librarian, knew everything about Millbrook's architecture. She showed him photographs of kitchens from that period, told him about the craftsmanship that had gone into these homes. Marcus listened like he was learning a language, committing details to memory. He began sketching in the evenings as autumn deepened. Not grand renderings but careful studies. A modest wooden island with a butcher block surface, something that would feel lived in immediately. Open shelving that could showcase Emma's pottery collection. A window seat beside the existing alcove where morning light pooled like honey. Soft colors that echoed the palette of the surrounding countryside. Cream and sage and warm cream. Materials that would age gracefully, that would develop character rather than show wear. Each sketch felt like a conversation with the cottage itself, as if the old walls were whispering their preferences to him. He thought about Emma baking bread in this space, about the smell of butter and flour and vanilla filling these rooms. He imagined her pointing out details to guests, this small renovation that had brought her joy. Between sketches, Marcus drove through the village and the surrounding countryside, photographing details. The weathered wood of a barn door, the way light fell through the windows of the library, the soft color of aged brick. He took pictures of doorways and doorknobs and hinges, studying how people had built things to last in this place, to endure. One afternoon, he sat with Emma and showed her his preliminary sketches. She traced her fingers across the pages, quiet for a long moment. When she looked up, her eyes were bright. She didn't say much, just thanked him, but something shifted in how she looked at him then. Marcus saw recognition there, the understanding that he had truly listened to her, that he had cared enough to invest time and thought into her dreams. That evening, alone in the studio, Marcus spread all his sketches across the work table. Somewhere between the decision to help and the actual work of learning, he had stopped feeling like a visitor in Millbrook. He had stopped viewing this time as an interruption to his real life. The cottage kitchen project had become something that mattered to him, not because it would advance his career or impress anyone, but because it was genuinely important to someone he was beginning to care for deeply. He picked up his pencil and continued working, adding details to a rendering of the completed space. His hands moved with a confidence he hadn't felt in months. This wasn't about proving himself or finding his way back to who he'd been. For the first time since arriving in Millbrook, Marcus sketched with genuine passion, envisioning a space that belonged to both Emma and this quiet place. The maple trees lining Millbrook's main street had transformed overnight into flames of crimson and gold. Marcus noticed this the moment he stepped out of the cottage that Saturday morning, the kind of observation that would have escaped him entirely just weeks before. In the city, autumn meant a slight temperature drop and the appearance of pumpkin spice in coffee shops. Here, it meant the world had set itself on fire with intention. Emma was already waiting on the porch when he emerged, wrapped in a soft cream cardigan that seemed to absorb the morning light. She smiled at him with a knowing warmth, as though she understood that something inside him had shifted. They had planned this walk together, nothing elaborate, just a simple wander through the village as the day grew longer around them. They moved slowly down the street, their pace deliberately unhurried. The air held a crispness that felt clean, untainted by exhaust or the stale breath of subway cars. Marcus found himself breathing more deeply, filling his lungs with the scent of earth and drying leaves. Each breath felt like a small permission he was giving himself, a moment of surrender to this place he had never intended to stay. Around them, the village was alive with the season's transformation. Storefronts displayed pumpkins and corn stalks in carefully arranged clusters. The bakery window held apple cinnamon rolls that perfumed the entire street. Residents called out greetings to Emma, and she responded with the ease of someone who truly belonged. Marcus noticed how she knew everyone's names, their stories, the small details of their lives that made them real rather than merely familiar. They turned onto a quieter lane that wound through older neighborhoods, where Victorian homes stood watching with their many windows. Here, the trees created a canopy above them, the leaves so thick and vibrant that the light filtered through in shades of amber and rose. Marcus paused, struck by the particular beauty of this filtered illumination. His mind began working through the problem of it, considering how he might capture this quality of light in a design, in stone or wood or glass. Emma noticed his stillness and didn't disturb it. She simply stood beside him, occasionally bending to collect leaves that pleased her eye. Her presence required nothing from him, asked him to perform no version of himself. This ease between them had grown gradually, like roots finding purchase in soil. He was beginning to understand that love, real love, was not the dramatic collision he had imagined in his younger years. It was the comfortable silence while walking through autumn light. They passed the elementary school, where children's laughter spilled over the fence in waves of pure sound. An old woman was raking leaves in her garden, and she waved at Emma with genuine delight. They walked past the church with its white steeple rising against the afternoon sky, past the library where warm light glowed from within, suggesting all the stories held in the darkness of its shelves. As they made their way toward the edge of the village where open fields began, Marcus felt something releasing inside his chest. For months he had been holding tension there, a tightness born from resistance and fear. The city had taught him to move with purpose, to treat every moment as either productive or wasted. But here, in the quiet between conversations, in the simple act of witnessing the turning of seasons with another person, he discovered a different kind of productivity. The soul was resting. His heart was learning something new. The path curved through a small copse of trees, where the leaves formed a soft carpet beneath their feet. Some leaves still clung to branches while others spiraled downward in lazy circles, released to whatever wind currents guided them. The light was turning golden as evening approached, painting everything in the warm tones of memory and comfort. Marcus held Emma's hand as leaves spiraled around them, and for a moment, he felt less like he was losing his old life and more like he was discovering something new. Rosa's coffee house occupied a corner lot that had served the same function for 43 years, according to a plaque by the door. Marcus discovered this on a gray Tuesday morning in late October, when the trees had surrendered most of their leaves and the air carried that particular bite that makes you want to wrap your hands around something warm. He had walked past the shop a dozen times without truly seeing it, but on this particular day, something drew him inside. Perhaps it was the smell of fresh ground beans that drifted onto the sidewalk, or perhaps it was simply the weight of the quiet morning pressing down on him. The interior was everything the exterior had promised. Mismatched wooden tables scattered throughout the small space, each one positioned near a window or nestled into corners that seemed designed for contemplation. Local artwork covered the walls, paintings of the surrounding hills and photographs of Millbrook from decades past. Behind the counter stood a woman with silver threading through her dark hair, her hands moving with practiced efficiency as she steamed milk for another customer's drink. That woman was Rosa, though Marcus didn't know her name yet. She looked up as he entered and offered a smile that reached her eyes, the kind of genuine greeting that felt increasingly rare in his experience. When he stepped up to order, she had already begun preparing something without being asked. "You're the fellow staying at the Hartwell place?" she said, not as a question but as a simple statement of fact. In a town of 2,000, apparently, nothing remained unknown for long. He nodded, and she continued, handing him a perfectly crafted cappuccino with a leaf design in the foam. "First one's on the house. Welcome to Millbrook." Her tone suggested she meant something deeper than mere commerce. Marcus returned the next morning, and the morning after that. By the following week, Rosa had learned that he took his cappuccino with an extra shot, that he preferred the corner table by the east window, and that he was the urban architect trying to write a book in their small town. In return, she began sharing pieces of Millbrook with him. She told him about the hardware store owner, Mr. Chen, whose father had established the business 50 years ago and who now mentored young people in the community like an unofficial guidance counselor. She spoke of the library director, Janet, who had turned the modest brick building into a cultural center that hosted writers, musicians, and community forums. There was the doctor who made house calls, the teenagers who voluntarily maintained the town park, the baker who donated day-old bread to the food pantry every evening. These weren't abstractions or statistics. As Rosa told their stories, her eyes would light up with genuine affection for these people she had known for decades. She spoke of their struggles too, their losses and disappointments, treating each person with the complexity and depth they deserved. Marcus found himself leaning forward, genuinely interested, asking questions he hadn't known he wanted to ask. One morning, nearly 2 weeks into his ritual visits, he brought a copy of his manuscript for Rosa to read. She had asked about it, and something in her manner suggested she would give him honest feedback rather than polite platitudes. She took it carefully, as if he had handed her something precious, and promised to return it within the week. When she did, her margins were filled with notes in elegant cursive. Most were encouraging, but she had circled passages where she felt his cynicism showed, where his characters seemed to lack the grace and forgiveness she knew people were capable of. "Write what you're learning here," she had written in the margin. "Write about how a place and its people can change you." Marcus visited the shop every weekday after that, watching the seasonal shift continue around him. He began to recognize regulars, to learn their names and their usual orders. The coffee shop became less a place where he got caffeine and more a place where he felt tethered to something genuine. When he worked at his laptop in the corner, he no longer felt like an observer but like part of something real. As Marcus left with his perfectly made cappuccino, Rosa called out to him by name, a small gesture that somehow made him feel more connected to this place than any conversation in the city ever had. The Harvest Festival transformed Millbrook's town square into a tapestry of lights, music, and the mingled scents of autumn spices and wood smoke. Marcus stood at the edge of the festivities, holding a steaming cup of cider that Rosa had pressed into his hands before he left the cafe, her knowing smile suggesting she understood he would need something warm to hold onto. The temperature had dropped considerably since sunset, and the crisp evening air carried the promise of an early frost. Strands of golden lights crisscrossed overhead, suspended between the old lampposts that had surely witnessed decades of these same celebrations. Wooden booths lined the perimeter of the square, each one decorated with dried corn stalks, pumpkins of varying sizes, and deep burgundy ribbons. The scents shifted as he wandered deeper into the crowd: cinnamon and nutmeg from the apple cider stand, caramelized sugar from the kettle corn vendor, the earthy richness of roasted chestnuts. What struck him most profoundly was not the decorations or the abundance of food, but the way the entire community moved through the space together. He watched old couples walking hand in hand past the craft booths, their steps synchronized by decades of shared rhythms. Families clustered around a pumpkin patch, children squealing as they selected the perfect specimen for carving. A group of teenagers hung back by the stage, pretending indifference while clearly very much present and aware of one another. Marcus drifted toward the local vendor tables, where neighbors sold their preserved goods and handmade items. There was Mrs. Chen, whom he recognized from the market, arranging jars of homemade jam in perfect rows. Next to her, the pastor's wife displayed hand-knitted scarves in shades of wine and gold. Everyone seemed to know everyone else, yet there was no exclusion in their acknowledgement. Newcomers and long-time residents alike were greeted with genuine warmth. He found himself at a booth displaying local honey, and the elderly man behind it began talking to him about the bees, about how the goldenrod and asters had produced an exceptional yield this year. The man didn't ask where Marcus had come from or what he did in the city. He simply shared knowledge freely, the way people do when they assume you might stay long enough for it to matter. That assumption alone felt revolutionary to Marcus. The band took the stage around 8 o'clock, a collection of local musicians who clearly knew one another's rhythms as well as the dancing couples seemed to know theirs. They launched into a spirited rendition of a folk tune, and the crowd began naturally migrating toward the open space in the center of the square. The dancing was unpretentious. Some couples moved with practiced elegance, others with the abandon of pure joy, and many simply swayed together, content to be held and to hold. Marcus remained at the periphery, watching the scene unfold before him like a photograph from another era. Yet there was nothing dated about these moments. He saw genuine connection everywhere: a grandmother teaching her granddaughter a particular step, a group of friends dissolving into laughter over a misstep, a young couple stealing glances at each other as if they were the only two people in the square. The cider had cooled to a comfortable temperature, and he sipped it slowly, letting its sweetness coat his throat. He thought about his previous autumns, spent in high-rise offices and trendy restaurants, surrounded by the constant noise of ambition and accomplishment. He had believed that was connection, had convinced himself that the people he knew in the city were his people. Yet standing here, anonymous in a crowd of 2,000 residents who somehow didn't feel anonymous to him, he recognized something he had been missing. Emma appeared beside him then, materializing from the crowd with the ease of someone who belonged everywhere in this town. She held out her hand, her eyes reflecting the golden lights, her smile carrying an invitation that extended beyond the dance floor. It invited him into something larger than himself, into this moment and these people and this place that had somehow begun to feel like possibility. As Emma pulled him toward the dance floor, Marcus realized he was smiling, genuinely, without reservation, and no longer counting what he had lost. The first hammer strike against the old kitchen cabinet echoed through the cottage like the sound of a new beginning. Marcus stood in the pale morning light filtering through the windows, tools spread across the counter before him like instruments waiting to be learned. Tom had arrived just after 7, his truck rumbling up the gravel drive with the confidence of someone who had done this 1,000 times. He was a broad-shouldered man in his 60s, with weathered hands that spoke of decades spent building and fixing the small injuries that time inflicted on houses. "We'll take this slow," Tom said, running his palm across the cabinet doors with the gentleness of someone greeting an old friend. No sense rushing something meant to last. They began by removing the upper cabinets, and Marcus quickly discovered that demolition was far more intricate than he had imagined. Tom showed him how to support the weight properly, how to locate the studs behind the drywall, how to use the correct leverage rather than brute force. There was poetry in the movement, Marcus thought, a rhythm that felt almost meditative as he worked alongside the older man. By mid-morning, they had established a pattern. Tom would demonstrate, then step back to let Marcus try. When mistakes happened, and they did, Tom simply smiled and showed him the better way. There was no frustration in his voice, only the patient instruction of someone who understood that learning required both success and failure. They worked through lunch, sharing sandwiches that Tom's wife had prepared, talking in the easy way that developed between people engaged in purposeful work. Tom spoke of other houses he had renovated, other families who had lived in them, the way a structure could hold generations of memories within its walls. He talked about his own home, how he and his wife had slowly transformed it over 30 years, room by room, never rushing, always choosing materials that would outlast them. "A house is like a relationship," Tom said, measuring a new cabinet frame with practiced efficiency. "You can't force it into shape. You have to understand what it needs, work with what you've got, and be patient enough to let it develop properly." Marcus found himself thinking of Emma as Tom spoke. He thought of the dance floor and the genuine smile he had felt spreading across his face, of how connection seemed to require the same patience Tom was describing, the same willingness to work within reality rather than against it. As the afternoon deepened, dust motes floated through the light like tiny celebrations of all that was being unmade and remade. The old kitchen was disappearing, and in its place, something new was beginning to take shape. Marcus realized he was no longer thinking about what he had left behind in the city, no longer cataloging losses. Instead, he was present in this moment, in this work, in the growing friendship with Tom. They discussed plans for the counter space, debating wood types and finishes. Tom showed Marcus how to read the grain in wood, how different materials told their own stories. He explained why certain choices lasted decades while others deteriorated quickly, lessons that seemed to extend beyond kitchens into life itself. As the sun began its descent toward the hills, casting long golden light across the cottage floor, Marcus felt something shifting inside him. The work was physical, yes, but it was also deeply grounding. Each piece they removed, each measurement they took, each decision about what would replace the old was an act of intention and care. Tom showed him how to properly clean the space, how to protect surfaces that would stay while preparing those that would be transformed. They swept together, and Tom told stories of other projects, other seasons, other people who had stood in similar cottages making similar decisions about renewal and restoration. The evening gathered around them as they stood surveying the day's work. The skeleton of the new kitchen was taking shape, waiting to be filled in with materials and effort and care. Marcus felt tired in a way that was entirely different from the exhaustion he had known in the city. This tiredness came from genuine engagement, from being fully present in something real and tangible and meaningful. Covered in dust and surprisingly content, Marcus and Tom shook hands as the evening fell, two men who had become friends through the simple act of building together. The email from his former firm arrived on a November morning when the sky hung low and gray over Millbrook. Marcus sat in the coffee shop, his laptop screen glowing with an offer that seemed to arrive from another lifetime. The words were precise, professional, enticing. Senior Project Director, $2 million development initiative, 6-month intensive timeline, a corner office on the 43rd floor of the building, where he used to dream of climbing higher. His coffee had gone cold while he read it 3 times, then 4. The salary was nearly double what he made now. The prestige was undeniable. The project was exactly the kind of work that had consumed him for 7 years before he came to Millbrook, seeking something unnamed and restless. Outside the coffee shop window, Main Street was transitioning into winter. The maple trees had dropped their leaves, and the storefronts were beginning to display their holiday decorations. Mrs. Chen was arranging wreaths in her flower shop window. 2 children walked past with their mother, their laughter muffled by scarves wrapped around their necks. The village was settling into itself, becoming smaller and warmer as the days shortened. Marcus left the coffee shop and walked without direction. His feet carried him past the community center, where Emma had shown him the autumn festival plans. Past Tom's hardware store, where the owner waved from inside. Past the elementary school, where he had volunteered to help fix the gymnasium floor. Each location felt like a thread, and somewhere in the distance, the city was pulling at them all, trying to unravel what he had carefully woven since arriving in this place. He found himself at Emma's office at the Town Development Center. Through the window, he could see her bent over her desk, her dark hair falling across her face as she concentrated on something. She looked up as if sensing his presence, and her expression shifted from focused work to something softer when she saw him. She waved him inside. The conversation happened almost without words at first. He told her about the emails. Her face remained calm, interested, unsurprised even. She asked him questions about the project, the timeline, what the work entailed. He answered, watching her carefully to see where disappointment might crack through her composure. It never came. Instead, she said something that would haunt him for days. "You should do what feels right," she told him, her hand briefly touching his arm. "If this is what you need, Marcus, you should go. I don't want you to resent this place or me by staying." The quiet acceptance in her voice was more terrifying than any argument could have been. He had expected her to fight for him, to say that what they had built together was more valuable than any corporate position. Instead, she was setting him free with a gentleness that somehow made the choice harder. He spent the next 2 days in a strange fog. He reviewed the project details obsessively. He imagined himself back in the city rhythm, back in the steel and glass environment where ambition felt like breathing. He calculated how many months he could endure long distance. He wondered if the old apartment in the city was still available. But he also thought about Tom's hand shaking his in the evening light, about Emma's laugh when he had finally mastered the correct way to organize the shelves in the community center library, about the feeling of actually knowing his neighbors' names, their histories, their children's names, about how silence here felt restorative rather than lonely, how stillness had become a luxury rather than a deprivation. The choice felt impossible because both paths were real. Both were legitimate versions of his life. The city represented achievement, momentum, the person he had trained himself to become. Millbrook represented something he had not known he was searching for, something that grew quietly and demanded less, but offered something unnamed in return. Marcus stared at the screen, knowing that the choice he made in the next few days would define not just his career, but his entire understanding of what mattered. Emma's eyes glistened as she confessed what she had been holding inside since Marcus arrived in town. They sat together on the weathered bench outside the library where they had first reconnected 3 months ago, the autumn air growing colder as November pressed forward. The leaves beneath their feet had turned from gold to brown, brittle and fragile, much like the delicate conversation unfolding between them. "I never wanted you to give up," Emma whispered, her voice trembling slightly. "Not for me, not for this place." Marcus turned to look at her fully, his expression shifting from the contentment he had worn all afternoon to something more serious. He reached for her hand, but Emma pulled back gently, needing space to say the words that had been weighing on her heart. "When you first came back, I was so happy I could barely think straight," she continued. "But then reality started creeping in. I started thinking about that offer you mentioned, the one in New York. I saw how your eyes lit up when you talked about the potential, about the resources, about what you could accomplish there. And I realized I've been letting you sacrifice something huge, without ever really saying it out loud, without ever acknowledging what it would mean. Emma's hands twisted together in her lap. She had spent sleepless nights wrestling with this fear, this guilt that had been building beneath her happiness. She had always prided herself on being fair, on not being the kind of person who would ask someone to shrink their dreams to fit into a small town life. "I've watched you walk through our village streets with such peace," Emma said, "and I convinced myself that was enough, that you wanted the quiet and the simplicity and the closeness of a small community. But I think I was wrong. I think I was seeing what I wanted to see." Marcus sat with her words for a long moment. The truth of them settled over him like the cooling evening air. He had been telling himself the same story, but hearing Emma voice her doubts somehow made everything clearer. "You're right," he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. "I've been making decisions based on what I thought would make you happy, on what would prove my feelings. But that's not fair to you. That's not even really loving you the way you deserve to be loved." Emma's eyes widened slightly as he continued. "I told myself that turning down that New York position was noble, that staying here meant I had my priorities straight. But maybe I was just afraid that if I admitted how much I wanted it, how much I've missed that kind of work and challenge, that you would feel like you were in my way. And I never want you to feel like that." He stood up and walked a few steps away, running his hand through his hair. When he turned back to face her, Emma could see the honesty and vulnerability in his eyes. "Emma, I love you. That hasn't changed. But I don't love you enough to spend the next 10 years wondering what might have happened if I'd been brave enough to chase what called to me. And you deserve someone who's here because they genuinely chose this life, not because they were afraid of losing you." Emma felt tears spill down her cheeks, but they were different tears than before. They were the tears of someone hearing a difficult truth spoken with compassion. "So what does that mean?" she asked, her voice small and frightened. "It means I need to figure out what I actually want," Marcus said. "Not what I think will make you happy, or make this work, or prove my love. Just what I want. And I need to be honest about whether that includes staying here or going. Whether it includes you or not. Because the only way this works is if we're both choosing it freely." He sat back down beside her, and this time she let him take her hand. They sat in silence as darkness gathered around them. Two people who loved each other but had to learn the hardest lesson of all. That sometimes love meant letting go enough to truly see what you were holding onto. That night, Marcus understood that love meant not making decisions out of obligation, but out of genuine choice. And that true love gave the other person permission to leave. Marcus wrote his rejection letter on a crisp morning when his mind was finally clear, and his heart aligned with his words. The autumn sun filtered through the cottage windows, casting amber rectangles across the weathered oak desk where he sat. Outside, the maples had turned a deep crimson, their leaves drifting down like whispers of change. He held his coffee mug between both hands, feeling its warmth anchor him to this moment, to this choice that had taken him nearly a week to fully comprehend. The job offer sat printed on the desk beside him, its corporate letterhead and impressive salary no longer glowing with the allure it once possessed. He read through it one final time, remembering the version of himself who would have seized this opportunity without hesitation. That Marcus had existed in a different lifetime, or so it felt. That Marcus had been running towards something, though he'd never quite understood what he was fleeing from. He began to type, his fingers moving with deliberate calm across the keyboard. The words came not from ambition or fear, but from a place of genuine knowing. He thanked the company for the opportunity. He acknowledged the generosity of the offer. He expressed his sincere appreciation for their confidence in his abilities. And then he stated, clearly and without apology, that he would not be accepting the position. As he composed each sentence, Marcus felt something shift inside him. It wasn't relief exactly, though relief was certainly part of it. It was something deeper, more foundational. It was the sensation of choosing himself, not in a selfish way, but in a true way. He was choosing the life that called to something genuine within him, rather than the life that impressed people he'd never truly know. The decision had crystallized slowly over the past days. He'd walked through Millbrook at dawn, when the town was still draped in mist and silence. He'd sat in the small bookshop where Emma sometimes worked, absorbing the quiet intelligence of the place. He'd spoken with people at the hardware store, at the community garden, at the library. These weren't networking conversations meant to advance his career. They were real exchanges between human beings who seemed to understand something about contentment that the city had taught him only to mock. Emma had been careful not to influence him. When they'd talked each night, she'd asked questions but made no suggestions. She'd listened to his fears without trying to minimize them. She'd held space for him to wrestle with this decision as though it belonged entirely to him, which it did. He loved her for that restraint, for that trust. It made his choice to stay mean something different than if he'd done it purely for her. He was staying for himself, for the person he wanted to become, and Emma was simply someone he wanted beside him on that journey. Marcus thought about his apartment in the city, about the perpetual noise and the faces of strangers pressed against strangers in elevators and trains. He thought about the endless cycle of proving himself, of climbing toward a future that seemed to recede even as he approached it. That life had validity for some people, he understood that now, but it had never truly been his. In Millbrook, he had found something the city couldn't sell him. He'd found quiet mornings and genuine conversations. He'd found work that would sustain him without demanding the entirety of his soul. He'd found Emma, but more importantly, he'd found himself. The version of himself that existed when he wasn't performing, when he wasn't proving anything to anyone. He read through the rejection letter once more, then leaned back in his chair. Outside, a cardinal landed on the fence post, brilliant red against the gray wood. The bird sat for a moment, absolutely still, and then flew away. Marcus understood that too. Sometimes you simply knew where you belonged, and you went there. His finger hovered over the send button. In another timeline, he might still be hesitating. But in this one, in this version of his life, he was ready. He hit send and felt not loss, but an unexpected sense of liberation. The kind that comes from choosing authenticity over obligation. December arrived with the first real snow, transforming Millbrook into a landscape of pristine white and silver shadows. Marcus stood at the threshold of the cottage that morning, watching fat flakes drift lazily from a pale gray sky, each one catching the thin winter light like a whispered promise. The world had grown softer overnight, the sharp edges of autumn's golden fields now blurred beneath a quilted blanket of snow. He breathed in the crystalline air, feeling it fill his lungs with a cleanness that seemed to reach into the corners of his chest. In the city, snow had always felt like an inconvenience, something to navigate around on crowded sidewalks, something that made the air feel claustrophobic despite the openness of the streets. Here, snow felt like an invitation to slowness, a gentle insistence that the world pause and rest alongside him. The village was preparing for winter with the unhurried grace of people who had done this dance for generations. Along the main street, merchants hung garland woven with dried berries and pine branches. The hardware store displayed shovels and salt in careful pyramids. At the market, local farmers arranged root vegetables and preserved goods with the satisfaction of people who understood the rhythm of seasons, who knew that winter's scarcity required summer's bounty and autumn's careful preparation. Marcus found himself drawn into these preparations with a participation that surprised him. He helped old Mr. Chen stack firewood against the side of the cottage, their breath forming clouds in the cold air as they worked in companionable silence. He attended the village council meeting where plans were discussed for the winter festival, volunteering without overthinking it to help coordinate the decorations. His hands were becoming calloused in new ways, his muscles remembering different tasks than they had performed in his previous life. But what moved him most was the quietness. The days grew shorter, the nights longer, and instead of feeling like a deprivation, it felt like a gift. There were hours now when the village seemed suspended in a kind of sacred stillness. Snow fell on nights when he sat by the fire with a book, creating a cocoon of warmth and comfort. The darkness that arrived at 5 o'clock in the evening no longer felt oppressive, but rather like permission to turn inward, to rest without guilt, to exist without the constant demand to produce or achieve. He thought often of the email he had sent, the one that had felt so terrifying in its honesty. The response had arrived within hours, surprisingly kind, suggesting that perhaps his departure had given others permission to examine their own dissatisfaction with the relentless pace. There was something liberating in discovering that the world continued without his constant vigilance, that his absence created space rather than crisis. The realization had settled into him gradually, like warmth returning to fingers after frostbite. The cottage itself seemed to embrace winter differently than it had embraced the other seasons. The thick stone walls held heat efficiently. The small windows framed the snowy landscape like paintings that changed throughout the day as light shifted and clouds moved. He had installed new weather stripping and checked the chimney, practical preparations that gave him a sense of purpose and self-reliance that felt entirely different from anything he had known before. One evening, as the snow continued its gentle accumulation, he sat with Alina at the village cafe, nursing hot cider while the windows frosted over around them. She spoke about her plans for the winter, the projects she would tackle in her studio, the books she intended to read. He realized that she was not asking him to fill spaces in her life, merely inviting him to share in the texture of her existing days. There was a profound peacefulness in that, a recognition that companionship did not require completion, but rather the simple presence of two people choosing to inhabit the same moments. As the evening deepened and he walked back toward the cottage, snow crunching softly beneath his boots, Marcus felt a completeness that had nothing to do with achievement and everything to do with belonging. The cottage glowed warmly ahead of him, smoke curling from its chimney, and he quickened his pace, drawn toward that light. Marcus watched the snow accumulate on the cottage roof, feeling sheltered rather than trapped, a fundamental shift in his perception of what home could mean. The new kitchen emerged from beneath tarps and dust like a promise finally kept. Marcus stood in the doorway, his work boots planted firmly on the original cottage floorboards, surveying the space with the quiet reverence of an artist stepping back from a completed canvas. 6 months of planning, measuring, sourcing materials, and careful renovation work had transformed Emma's cramped and dated cooking space into something that felt both entirely new and timelessly rooted in the cottage's heritage. The morning light streamed through the window above the sink, illuminating the subtle grain of the reclaimed oak cabinetry he had painstakingly restored. Each door bore the marks of time, gentle dents and color variations that told stories of decades past. Rather than hide these imperfections, Marcus had chosen to honor them, treating each scratch as evidence of the kitchen's lived history. The deep green paint on the lower cabinets complemented the buttery cream of the upper shelves, creating a warmth that seemed to embrace anyone who entered the room. The countertops represented his proudest achievement. He had selected a local craftsperson who worked with reclaimed materials, and together they had designed a surface that incorporated pale limestone set with subtle grain patterns. The stone felt substantial beneath his palm, cool and enduring, promising years of service without requiring the perfection that granite or marble demanded. There was grace in its imperfections, its readiness to develop character through use. Marcus ran his fingers along the edge of the new wooden counter, where Emma could sit for coffee and conversation. He had designed this detail himself, remembering the way she often lingered in kitchens, valuing the space as much for gathering as for cooking. The smooth curve he had crafted felt personal, intentional, a small signature of care embedded into the bones of the cottage. The appliances, though modern, had been chosen for their simplicity and durability rather than their complexity. He had resisted Emma's initial suggestion to install a massive professional range, instead finding a smaller, vintage-inspired stove that matched the cottage's proportions and aesthetic. Function had dictated every choice, never overshadowed by trend or fashion. This kitchen would serve Emma faithfully for decades, asking only for proper maintenance and care. The finishing touches lined the shelves and counters now. Open wooden shelving along one wall displayed the pottery bowls and mason jars that had become part of Emma's daily life in the village. Below, a deep porcelain apron sink, original to the cottage and carefully restored, reflected the afternoon light like a small, still pool. Beside it, the wooden drain board he had crafted from offcuts of the original floorboards added another layer of cohesion, making the new elements feel like they had always belonged. Marcus thought back to the day he had first arrived in the village, raw from his corporate burnout, skeptical of small-town life and suspicious of permanence. The kitchen renovation had become a mirror for his own transformation. He had learned through this project that creation required patience, that beauty emerged from respecting what came before rather than attempting to erase it. Every decision made during these months had reflected his shifting understanding of what mattered. Authenticity over appearance, substance over speed, integration rather than domination. The cottage had become more than a renovation project. Standing here now, Marcus recognized it as evidence of his own capacity to build something meaningful, to invest himself in work that would outlast his enthusiasm. This kitchen would hold countless meals, conversations, quiet mornings, and celebration dinners. It would age gracefully, developing patina and character, much like the man who had created it. He heard Emma's footsteps on the stairs before she appeared in the doorway, still wearing her wool coat from her walk through the village. Her expression shifted from curiosity to wonder as she took in the completed space, and Marcus felt the familiar flutter of nerves beneath his pride. As Emma traced her fingers along the countertops Marcus had designed, he felt the profound satisfaction of creating something that would last, something that mattered. When Tom mentioned the community center needed repairs before winter, Marcus volunteered without hesitation and surprised himself in doing so. A year ago, such an impulse would have seemed foreign to him, a notion belonging to someone else entirely. Yet here he stood in the autumn afternoon, having already committed himself to 3 weekends of labor, drawn by something he couldn't quite name. Perhaps it was the weight of Emma's hand in his that morning, or the way the village had slowly become less a temporary retreat and more a true home. The community center sat at the heart of the village, a modest wooden structure built in the 1970s that had weathered decades with grace and accumulated character. Its roof sagged slightly on the eastern corner, and its foundations needed reinforcing before the heavy snows arrived. Tom, who seemed to know everyone and everything about the village, had organized a work party. When Marcus asked to help, Tom's weathered face broke into a genuine smile that suggested he had somehow expected this all along. That first Saturday, Marcus arrived before dawn to find the parking area already filling with pickups and older sedans. Men and women of all ages emerged carrying toolboxes and thermoses of coffee, moving with the easy coordination of people who had worked together many times before. He recognized the baker from the shop near Emma's cottage, the retired librarian who had recommended books to him last month, the hardware store owner who had become something like a friend. They greeted him with simple nods and welcomes that held no awkwardness, no sense that he was an outsider finally being allowed in. He simply belonged, as though he always had. The work was honest and demanding. Marcus found himself hoisting lumber, measuring angles, driving nails with a steady rhythm that gradually became meditative. His hands, so accustomed to delicate design work, grew calloused and bruised. His back ached by midday, yet with each task completed, he felt something settling inside him, something that hadn't been quiet since childhood. The conversation around him flowed in the easy way of people comfortable with silence and work. Someone would crack a joke that made the group laugh. Someone else would offer water or a snack. Children played nearby on the grass, watched by rotating shifts of parents, representing the future this place would continue building. Emma brought lunch on the second weekend, a spread of sandwiches and salads that she and Mrs. Chen had prepared. She moved through the workers with natural grace, knowing who wanted what, asking about their families, their work. When she reached Marcus, she set down his plate with a soft smile and squeezed his shoulder briefly before moving on. That small gesture, performed without self-consciousness in front of everyone, made his heart expand in a way that surprised him with its intensity. This was what it meant to be known and accepted. This was what it meant to belong to a place and have a place belong to you. By the third weekend, Marcus found himself directing some of the structural work, sharing ideas about how to reinforce the walls while preserving the building's character. Tom listened to his suggestions seriously, implemented those that made sense, and thanked him genuinely when others praised the improvements. There was no ego in it, no competition. Everyone simply wanted the work done well because the community center mattered to them. They had celebrated graduations there. They had held vigils and memorials within those walls. They had danced at weddings and gathered through countless winters. The work progressed steadily through the autumn weeks. The roof was reinforced and reshingled. The foundations were shored up with new concrete. Inside, walls were repaired, painted, prepared for the activities that would fill the space through the coming year. With each task, Marcus felt the village absorbing him more fully, and he felt himself giving something real back to it. This wasn't designed for distant clients who would never know his name. This was tangible contribution to the place where he had learned to love again, where he had discovered that home was not something you inherited, but something you built gradually, through small acts of care and connection. As he helped frame a new wall alongside neighbors he had come to know by name, Marcus felt the deep satisfaction of being part of something bigger than himself. The snow fell thick and heavy on a Friday evening, and by nightfall, the town square was filled with bundled figures dancing under lights strung between bare trees. Marcus stood at the edge of the gathering, watching in wonder as the village transformed into something from a dream. He had lived in the city for so long that he had forgotten such moments could exist, that people could gather with no formal invitation, no scheduled event, just the simple magic of the first snow bringing everyone together. Emma appeared beside him, her cheeks flushed from the cold, her breath visible in small clouds that dissipated into the winter air. She took his hand without a word, and he felt the familiar warmth of her touch even through their gloves. The string lights cast a golden glow across her face, and Marcus found himself mesmerized by the way the snowflakes landed delicately on her dark hair like tiny diamonds. The village single band, made up mostly of teenagers and retired musicians, played from the gazebo. Their music was simple but heartfelt, a blend of folk songs and gentle jazz that seemed to float through the snow itself. Children darted between the dancing adults, their laughter crystalline and pure. Old Mr. Chen, who ran the bookstore, swayed gently with his wife, their movements slow and synchronized from decades of dancing together. The Johnsons, who lived 3 doors down from Marcus's cottage, spun with reckless joy, their teenage daughter filming everything on her phone yet still managing to smile genuinely at the scene around her. Emma pulled Marcus toward the center of the square, and he felt a moment of self-consciousness before it dissolved entirely. Nobody was watching him with judgment. Nobody cared that he had spent the last decade in boardrooms and conference calls. Here, in this moment, he was simply a man holding the hand of a woman he loved, surrounded by a community that had slowly, inexorably become his home. They began to dance, though dance seemed too formal a word for what they were doing. It was more like swaying together, moving in the rhythm of the music and the falling snow. Emma's laugh was bright and unguarded, and Marcus found himself laughing too, not at anything in particular, but simply from the overwhelming joy of the moment. Snow melted on his cheeks, his fingers intertwined with hers beneath layers of wool. He thought about the wall he had helped frame just days ago, the way his hands had learned the rhythm of hammering, the way his neighbors had worked alongside him without comment or concern about his city's softened palms. He thought about the autumn when he had arrived, exhausted and hollow, and how the seasons had gently filled him with something he couldn't quite name. He had come here running from something, but he was staying for something else entirely. He was staying for this. An old woman he recognized from the bakery pressed a cup of hot cider into his free hand, winking at Emma before disappearing back into the crowd. The drink was spiced and perfect, warming him from the inside out. All around them, the village continued its spontaneous celebration. Someone had brought a small speaker that played softer music as the band took a break. Multicolored lights reflected off the fresh snow, creating patterns that seemed almost supernatural in their beauty. Marcus realized he was genuinely, completely happy. Not the surface happiness of a successful deal or a promotion, but something deeper and more fundamental. This was the happiness of belonging, of being known and accepted, of finding his place in the quiet rhythms of a small community. The city felt impossibly distant now, like a story he had read long ago. All those years of ambition and striving seemed to belong to someone else, someone he used to be. Emma shifted against him, and he wrapped his arm around her shoulders. The snow continued to fall, undisturbed by human concerns or schedules. It simply fell, beautiful and gentle, covering the village in white. With Emma's head resting on his shoulder and snow catching in her hair, Marcus felt like he was exactly where he was meant to be. The letters and emails arrived like echoes from a previous life, curious voices asking whether Marcus had lost his mind. They came throughout the winter months, stacked on the small desk in his cottage, each one carrying the weight of his former world. His college roommate David sent a message wondering if he was depressed. His former mentor Patricia wrote with barely concealed concern, asking if this was a phase. His colleagues from the marketing firm sent congratulatory notes that felt more like questions, as if they were still waiting for him to announce this had all been some elaborate joke. Marcus would read these messages while sitting by the fire, Emma nestled beside him with a book open on her lap, and something remarkable would happen. Instead of feeling defensive or ashamed, he felt a quiet clarity. He knew exactly why he was here. The question wasn't whether he had lost his mind, but whether he had finally found it. One Saturday afternoon, he sat down with tea and began responding to each letter with intentional care. To David, he wrote about the difference between running from something and running towards something. The city had been a race without finish line, a constant striving that left him hollow despite its brightness. Here in Millbrook, the pace allowed for depth. He could know his neighbors not as names in a crowded office, but as real people with real stories. He could see the direct impact of his work at the community center, watching young people transform through programs he helped design. That wasn't depression, that was purpose. To Patricia, he explained that this wasn't a phase but an awakening. He had spent 15 years climbing a ladder that leaned against the wrong building. The salary, the title, the corner office, these things had promised fulfillment but delivered only exhaustion. What he had discovered in Millbrook couldn't be found on a resume. It lived in the way Emma smiled at him over breakfast. It lived in the genuine friendships he had built, the kind where people knew his actual self rather than his professional persona. It lived in Saturday mornings at the farmer's market and Thursday nights volunteering at the library. None of these things would impress people at cocktail parties, but they were real in a way his former life had never been. When his former colleagues reached out, Marcus surprised himself with his honesty. He acknowledged that yes, he had taken a significant pay cut. Yes, the winters were long and the cultural offerings were limited. Yes, sometimes he missed the anonymity of the city and the instant gratification of its entertainment. But these were small prices compared to what he had gained. He had gained time. He had gained meaning. He had gained Emma, though he didn't mention her by name in his professional correspondence, keeping that treasure private and sacred. What struck Marcus most as he wrote was that he wasn't crafting arguments or building a case anymore. He wasn't trying to convince anyone that he had made the right choice. Instead, he was simply describing his own experience with honesty. Some people would understand. Some would continue to worry about him. Some would dismiss his choices as naive or provincial. But that no longer mattered to him in the way it once had. Emma would occasionally read over his shoulder, offering suggestions or simply nodding in agreement at his words. She understood what he was articulating because she saw it every day in his face, in the way he moved through the world now with less urgency and more presence. This wasn't the performance of happiness, but its authentic presence. As he sealed each envelope and clicked send on each email, Marcus felt something settle inside him. The people from his previous life would either understand or they wouldn't. Either way, he was at peace with his choice. The landscape beyond his window held snow-covered fields and distant hills. Emma was beside him. Spring would come, and they would plant a garden together. Summer would follow, and they would walk the green lanes of Millbrook hand in hand. These simple certainties felt like the greatest luxury he had ever known. In his responses, Marcus discovered he wasn't trying to convince them anymore. He was simply sharing the truth about his own journey without apology or explanation. When the storm hit, it cut off Millbrook from the outside world with the finality of a closing door. Marcus watched from the window of his apartment above the bookstore as snow fell in thick, deliberate sheets, transforming the familiar streets into something quieter and more essential. The town had been warned, of course. The Weather Service had predicted a significant system moving through the region, but there was something about witnessing it actually arrive that made the warning real in a way no forecast ever could. By evening, the roads were impassable. By morning, the village sat in a cocoon of white silence. Marcus had lived his entire adult life in cities where weather was merely an inconvenience, something that disrupted schedules and required adjusted routes. But here in Millbrook, the storm felt different. It wasn't an interruption to life. It was a profound pause within it. The bookstore remained closed. Without power lines down and with the heating still functioning, Marcus could have opened, but it wouldn't have mattered. The few cars that belonged to hardy residents remained parked in driveways and along streets. The world had simply stopped, and Marcus found himself relieved rather than frustrated by this enforced slowness. He settled into a rhythm that felt almost meditative. Morning coffee while watching the snow continue to fall, thick flakes catching the pale winter light. Then hours with books, the kind of uninterrupted reading that city life had made nearly impossible. No emails to check, no texts demanding responses, no background hum of constant availability. The power remained on, but the connectivity that usually defined his days had become irrelevant. Emma arrived around noon on the second day, appearing like a figure from a winter story, bundled in a dark coat with snow clinging to her hair. She had walked from her cottage, she explained, needing to check on him or perhaps needing an excuse to see him. Marcus couldn't quite determine which, and it didn't matter. She was there, and the small apartment felt suddenly warm in a way that had nothing to do with the heating system. They moved together with an ease that surprised him. Emma brought fresh bread from her last baking before the roads became impassable, and they made tea, then soup, their movements synchronized in the kitchen like a choreography they had always known. They talked in the way that only became possible when the world outside had diminished to irrelevance. Emma told him about winters in the village over her lifetime, how the isolation had once felt suffocating when she was younger and eager to escape. Marcus found himself explaining how the isolation felt liberating now, how it had taken leaving the city and getting snowed in with nowhere to be for him to understand what true freedom might actually feel like. As afternoon softened into evening, they lit the fireplace, watching the flames rise and dance against the brick. They sat close together on the worn couch, not needing to fill every silence with words. Sometimes Emma would point out how the firelight caught particular shadows on the walls. Sometimes Marcus would simply notice the way her hair reflected the orange glow, or how her hand rested near his. The hours unfolded without urgency. They read to each other in turns. They played a card game that had been in the apartment's cabinet, forgotten from previous tenants. They made simple food when hunger suggested it. They existed in a space entirely removed from the demands of their regular lives, suspended in time by snow and proximity and choice. When night deepened, Emma didn't leave. There was an unspoken understanding that walking back to her cottage through the snow would be unnecessary and unwise, though the truth was more subtle than practicality. They both recognized something precious in this unexpected gift of isolation, this enforced removal from the machinery of ordinary time. They lay together as the fire slowly dimmed to embers, her back against his chest, his arms loosely around her, watching the shadows flicker and fade. Outside, the snow continued to fall, silent and patient, maintaining the boundary between Millbrook and the rest of the world. Snowed in with Emma, firelight dancing across the walls, Marcus realized that isolation and freedom could be the same thing, depending on your perspective. November had barely passed when Millbrook began its slow transformation into a living holiday card. The village moved with purpose now, a collective understanding settling over its residents like fresh snow. Main Street sprouted garlands strung between lamp posts, emerald ribbons wound around wrought iron fixtures that had stood for generations. The hardware store, where Marcus had become a familiar face, displayed wreaths made from local branches and dried flowers. He found himself lingering there longer than necessary, watching old Mr. Henderson arrange displays with the care of someone performing ritual. Emma had mentioned the annual holiday bazaar, her voice carrying an excitement that made Marcus want to understand what it meant to her. He learned it was more than a market. It was the village's heartbeat made visible, families selling homemade goods, children performing carols in the town square, the library hosting hot cider and storytelling. The bazaar happened the first Saturday of December, and Emma had already volunteered to help set up. Marcus had never been someone who cared much for holidays. In the city, they felt obligatory, rushed, transactional. His apartment would accumulate store-bought gifts selected from lists, consumed quickly, forgotten by January. But standing in Millbrook's center now, watching the careful attention given to every decoration, every tradition, something shifted in him. He began spending his evenings in the village, observing without quite participating. He watched the volunteer fire department string lights across the town hall. He saw Mrs. Shen arranging luminarias in front of the community center, tiny flames flickering like prayers. He noticed how people greeted each other differently now, with an additional warmth, as though the coming holidays gave them permission to soften their usual defenses. One afternoon, Emma found him at the cottage studying the eaves. She carried a cardboard box filled with lights, their cords tangled in that way that made them look more complicated than they actually were. "I was going to ask if you wanted to help," she said, setting the box down on the porch steps. "But I see you were already thinking about it." He had been thinking about it. He had driven past the cottage every day for 2 weeks, noting how other homes along the lane glowed with color and warmth while his remained dark. The silence of it had begun to feel less like peace and more like absence. They untangled the lights together on the porch, their fingers occasionally brushing, their conversation drifting between practical logistics and memories. Emma talked about hanging lights as a child, how her father would position the ladder while her mother called out instructions from the ground. It became clear to Marcus that she was offering him something beyond the simple act of decoration. She was inviting him into her childhood, her way of saying he belonged to the texture of her past now. The work itself was meditative, threading lights through clips, testing sections to ensure they glowed, stepping back to assess the overall effect. Marcus found himself moving slowly, deliberately, not rushing toward completion but rather savoring the process. Evening came as they worked, the sky bleeding into shades of amber and deep purple before settling into darkness. The cottage lights came on gradually. First one section glowed pale gold, then another caught, and another, until the entire eve was outlined in warm white light. It reflected off the snow that had begun to fall sometime during the afternoon, creating an effect that made the cottage look like something from a fantasy, removed from ordinary time. Emma stood beside him on the lawn, her coat dusted with snowflakes, her face illuminated by the lights they had hung together. She looked at the cottage and then at him, and in her expression he saw recognition, as though she understood that something had just shifted inside him. When she reached over and took his hand, it felt like the most natural thing in the world. His hand was cold, hers was warm, and together they stood in the falling snow and looked at what they had created. Marcus and Emma hung lights on the cottage eaves together, and he realized this ordinary moment was shaping into a memory he would treasure forever. The town tree, a towering spruce that anchored the village square, awaited its transformation into the symbol of Millbrook's holiday spirit. Marcus stood at the edge of the gathering crowd, watching volunteers string lights through the dense green branches. He held a thermos of hot cider that Emma had pressed into his hands before she hurried off to help coordinate the carolers. Around him, the entire village seemed to move with purposeful joy, each person contributing to the evening's magic in their own way. A year ago, he would have stood exactly where he was now, but invisible. He would have observed this ceremony as an outsider, someone documenting the quaint traditions of small-town life without truly belonging to them. The thought made him smile. That Marcus felt like a different person entirely. Old Mr. Chen from the bookshop waved at him and called out a greeting about the cottage renovations. Mrs. Patterson, who ran the bakery, asked if he wanted her famous gingerbread cookies, holding up a tin she'd brought to share. These were not polite acknowledgments anymore, but genuine welcomes, the kind of recognition that came from showing up repeatedly, from becoming a familiar face in the fabric of community. The mayor began making his annual speech about gratitude and togetherness, his voice carrying across the square through a sound system that crackled slightly with age. Marcus found himself actually listening, not detaching into the cynical distance that used to be his default. The words about belonging, about how a town survives through the care its residents show one another, landed differently now. He wasn't just hearing them, he was understanding them from the inside. Emma appeared beside him, her cheeks flushed from the cold, her hair crowned with a knit hat that made her look impossibly young. She linked her arm through his without hesitation, a gesture that had become so natural between them that they both seemed to have forgotten it was ever different. She squeezed his arm gently. "Ready?" she asked, though she was already guiding him toward the group of carolers gathering near the tree's base. Marcus had learned 3 songs over the past week. Christmas carols he'd heard 1,000 times before, but never bothered to truly learn. Emma had sat beside him at the piano in the cottage's front room, playing the melodies while he followed along in a worn songbook that had belonged to the house's previous owners. The experience of learning these simple songs had been unexpectedly tender, a quiet meditation on tradition and continuity. The carolers began to move through the gathered villagers, and Emma's voice lifted in clear, confident harmony. Marcus opened his mouth and found the notes, his voice rougher than hers but sincere. Around them, other residents joined in, creating an imperfect but warming chorus that seemed to wrap around everyone gathered. Children sat on their parents' shoulders. Teenagers stood with their arms around each other. Elderly couples held hands, their eyes distant with memory. Dogs on leashes tilted their heads at the sounds. It was achingly, impossibly wholesome, and yet Marcus wasn't embarrassed by his presence in it. He was part of it now. He belonged in this moment because he had chosen to stay, to participate, to let himself be changed by this place and its people. The final song began, and the volunteers on ladders reached up to flip the master switch. The tree illuminated all at once, thousands of small white lights transforming the spruce into something ethereal and sacred. A collective gasp rose from the crowd, the same gasp that probably happened every year, that same recognition of beauty and tradition and hope. Emma squeezed his hand. He looked down at her, watching her face in the reflected glow of the lights, and felt something settle inside him that had been restless for years. This was home, not the physical space of the cottage or the village itself, though he loved both dearly. Home was this feeling of being known, of being wanted, of choosing to stay and being chosen in return. As the lights illuminated the ancient tree, Marcus sang along to carols he'd learned growing up, feeling the past and present merge into something whole. Christmas Eve arrived as quietly as snow, without fanfare or the desperate energy Marcus remembered from city holiday seasons. In the city, the holidays were a frenetic blur of crowded shopping centers, aggressive sales, and endless obligations. Here in the village, Christmas simply unfolded with the gentle inevitability of winter itself. Marcus and Emma sat together in the cottage as afternoon light turned to early evening. There were no elaborate plans between them, no reservations at expensive restaurants or tickets to exclusive shows. Instead, they had decided together that this Christmas would be theirs alone, unmarked by anything but presence and simple comfort. The cottage smelled of cinnamon and bread. Emma had spent the morning baking, filling the kitchen with warmth and flour dust. Now the loaves sat cooling on the counter, their golden crusts catching what remained of the daylight. She had made them from scratch, following her grandmother's recipe, the same one she had mentioned to Marcus weeks ago during a conversation that had felt like nothing, but had somehow meant everything. They had decorated the main room with things they found together during a walk through the village 2 days prior. Pine branches cut from the woods behind the cottage now rested along the mantelpiece, their needles releasing their sharp green scent whenever someone passed. Holly with its bright berries sat in a glass pitcher on the small table by the window. There was no elaborate tree like the one in the town square, but rather a single branch from the old oak that stood in the cottage garden, placed in a bucket of water and adorned with paper stars Emma had cut out by hand. It was imperfect and beautiful in a way that felt revolutionary to Marcus. As evening deepened, they lit candles throughout the room, not because electricity had failed, but because candlelight felt right. It felt true. They sat on the worn sofa, wrapped in a quilt that smelled like lavender, and ate the bread Emma had made along with cheese from the market and apple cider that they heated in a small pot. There was no feast, no multiple courses, no performance of abundance. Yet Marcus felt more nourished than he could remember feeling. Emma rested her head on his shoulder as they sat together in the growing darkness, illuminated only by candlelight and the embers of the fire. She was quiet, but her quietness was not empty. It was full of contentment. Marcus had learned the difference between the two since arriving in this village. In the city, silence between people often felt like failure, a gap that needed to be filled with words or entertainment. Here, silence was a language all its own, and Emma spoke it fluently. They listened to the wind move through the trees outside, carrying with it the promise of snow. The cottage felt like the entire world, and perhaps it was. Perhaps the world had always been this small and intimate, and people in the cities had simply forgotten how to see it. At some point, Emma began to hum. It was the carol from the town square lighting, the one Marcus had sung along to days before. He joined her, their voices blending in the small space, creating harmonies that seemed to belong to the cottage itself, as though the walls had been waiting for these particular voices to complete them. Later, they moved to sit on the floor in front of the fireplace, back against the sofa, watching the flames dance. Emma fell asleep first, her head tilting toward Marcus's shoulder, then settling against his chest. He wrapped his arm around her and remained perfectly still, not wanting to disturb her or the fragile magic of this moment. The fire crackled softly. Outside, frost was forming on the windows in delicate patterns. Inside, there was only warmth and the steady sound of Emma's breathing. Marcus thought about the person he had been a year ago in the city, rushing through December with a sense of obligation and exhaustion. That person seemed to belong to a different lifetime. With Emma asleep against his chest and the fire slowly dying in the hearth, Marcus felt completely, perfectly content. The last day of the year arrived with the weight of transformation, the realization that Marcus was no longer the person who had driven into Millbrook 6 months ago. He sat in the quiet kitchen of the cottage that had become his home, nursing a cup of coffee grown cool from hours of stillness, watching the pale winter light filter through windows he no longer saw as obstacles, but as doorways to the landscape he had learned to love. The reflection came not as a sudden epiphany, but as a gentle knowing that settled over him like snow. He thought back to that autumn morning when he had arrived with his carefully packed boxes and his carefully constructed walls, a man running away from the noise and chaos, believing silence alone could heal what had been broken inside him. He had not understood then that healing requires more than escape. It requires belonging. It requires being seen by others and seeing them in return. Emma stirred in the bedroom upstairs, and Marcus smiled at the sound of her footsteps, the simple domesticity of it filling him with warmth that had nothing to do with the radiator humming beneath the window. She appeared in the doorway wearing one of his sweaters, her hair tangled from sleep, and she looked at him with an expression that contained the entire year in its softness. When had he stopped feeling like an outsider and started feeling like this was where he belonged? It had happened gradually. He understood now, not in one moment of revelation, but in 1,000 small moments of connection. He thought of Mrs. Chen at the library, who had taught him the names of the old trees beyond the village limits. He thought of Tom at the hardware store, who now greeted him with a knowing nod and a reserved smile that meant more than it appeared to. He thought of the Thursday evening gatherings at the pub, where skepticism had given way to genuine friendships forged over darts and stories, and the kind of laughter that echoes in one's chest long after the evening ends. These people had not asked him to change. They had simply welcomed him, and in being welcomed, he had discovered how to change himself. Emma sat beside him and took his coffee cup, stealing a sip before wrapping her hands around it for warmth. She asked no questions about his quiet contemplation. This was another gift the village had taught him: the comfort of silence shared with another person, the profound intimacy of simply existing together without the constant need to fill space with words. The changes within him had been quiet and surprising. He no longer felt the urgent pull to check his phone for emails from the city office he had left behind. The ambition that once drove him relentlessly had not disappeared, but had transformed into something gentler: the desire to build something meaningful rather than something impressive. He had started sketching plans for renovations to the cottage, not to increase its value, but because he wanted to make it more beautiful. He had begun reading poetry again, something he had abandoned years ago in the pursuit of spreadsheets and advancement. He had even joined the village effort to restore the old stone bridge at the edge of town, not for recognition, but for the pleasure of working with his hands alongside others who shared his purpose. Most remarkably, he had learned to forgive himself. The guilt that had driven him away from the city had not vanished, but he had come to understand that running toward something was fundamentally different than running away. He had run toward Emma, toward community, toward possibility. He had run toward a version of himself he did not know existed, one who could find joy in small things, one who could be present in the moment rather than always reaching toward the next achievement. The year had come full circle. Autumn had turned to winter, and now the winter was turning back toward spring. Marcus gazed out at the frost-covered garden and felt no impatience for the season to change. Each season had brought its own grace, and he had learned to receive it. As the clock struck midnight, Marcus didn't make resolutions about who he wanted to become. He simply celebrated who he had become. January stretched long and quiet, a blank canvas of white days and dark nights where time seemed to move according to its own ancient rhythm. Marcus had returned to the cottage after the New Year celebrations at the village hall, where Sarah had smiled at him across the room 3 times, he counted, and where Mrs. Chen had pressed homemade dumplings into his hands with the certainty of someone who knew exactly what people needed. The aftermath of the holiday felt less like emptiness and more like permission. Permission to pause. Permission to think without the relentless pulse of productivity demanding his attention. The cottage wrapped around him like a comfortable silence. He had begun leaving the studio lamp on through the mornings, watching the pale winter light filter through frost-traced windows while he worked at his drafting table. His fingers moved across paper with a slowness that once would have frustrated him. In the city, speed equaled value. Here, in these hushed weeks where the village seemed to hold its breath, slowness revealed something unexpected. He was designing a community center for a neighboring town. The project had arrived almost casually, through conversations at the hardware store, through the kind of organic networking that small places cultivated naturally. Rather than rushing to present concepts, Marcus found himself simply sitting with the space in his mind. He imagined how light would move through different seasons. He considered where people might naturally gather, pause, find shelter. He thought about Sarah's face when she talked about needing better meeting spaces for the local artists collective. He thought about what it meant to build something that served people you actually knew. The creative process transformed. Without the noise of competing deadlines, his vision could breathe. He sketched buildings that spoke spoke to the landscape rather than dominating it. His designs began incorporating local materials: stone from the quarry 5 miles east, timber from the Sustainable Forest Cooperative. These weren't compromises born from budget constraints, but genuine choices that felt right, that felt honest. Each decision carried the weight of intention rather than the pressure of ambition. On particularly cold afternoons, he would brew tea and sit by the south-facing window, watching how the light changed across the white fields. Sarah had taught him to notice such things. She would pause mid-conversation and say, "Look at how the sun hits the barn right now." And he had learned that such moments weren't distractions, but rather the texture of a life fully inhabited. Now he found himself reaching for his sketchbook to capture exactly those qualities of light and shadow, those fugitive moments that made a place feel like home. The solitude suited him. He had once feared that leaving the city would leave him creatively hollow, that the stimulation of crowded streets and competitive studios was necessary fuel. Instead, he discovered that solitude was not emptiness, but rather a kind of fullness. It allowed thoughts to complete themselves. It permitted complexity to unfold without interruption. The ideas that emerged felt more grounded, more connected to actual human need rather than theoretical elegance. One evening, Sarah came by with soup from her mother, stamping snow from her boots and bringing cold air and laughter into the warm cottage. She moved naturally through the space now, hanging her coat on the hook he had installed, settling into the chair beside his drafting table as though she belonged there, which somehow she increasingly did. He showed her his sketches without the defensive explanation he once would have provided. She looked for a long time, her dark eyes moving across the drawings with the attention of someone who genuinely understood what she was seeing. "This is different," she said quietly. "Better. More you." "What do you mean, more me?" "It's not trying so hard. It's just being." She smiled, that particular smile that had become familiar, that made his chest expand with something that felt like coming home. "You're not reaching anymore. You're just here, building things that matter." He looked at his sketches spread across the table, at months of work distilled into purposeful visions. He thought about the year that had passed, about how a place could change you if you let it, about how stillness could be as productive as motion. Marcus's sketchbook filled with ideas that were more refined and purposeful than anything he had created during his city years of constant rush and competition. Emma sketched her dreams on napkins and scraps of paper, building castles of imagination that Marcus was now eager to help make real. They sat in the worn leather armchairs near the bookstore's front window, afternoon light casting golden rectangles across the worn wooden floors. The autumn had deepened into early November, and the village outside seemed to settle into a quieter rhythm, as if the entire town was leaning in to listen to what Emma wanted to share. She unfolded her sketches with gentle hands, spreading them across the small table between them like an artist revealing something deeply personal. Marcus watched her face, the way her eyes lit up with each possibility she described, and he felt something shift within his chest. This wasn't about the bookstore anymore. This was about Emma's heart laid bare in pencil marks and hopeful margins. The expansion she envisioned was modest by city standards, but enormous in ambition for their little village. She wanted to knock down the walls separating the bookstore from the empty storefront next door, creating one flowing space where readers could wander freely. There would be a cozy reading nook with oversized chairs and soft lighting in one corner, a small cafe serving local coffee in another. Most importantly, she wanted a dedicated children's section with a reading corner shaped like a treehouse, where young voices could fill the air with the magic of stories. Marcus found his pencil moving instinctively, taking her napkin sketches and translating them into something more concrete. His architectural training, something he had come to resent during his years in the city, suddenly felt like a gift. He suggested structural possibilities that wouldn't compromise the historic integrity of the building. He sketched how the dividing wall could be removed while maintaining the original beams that gave the space its character. His hands moved with purpose, creating floor plans and elevation drawings, and Emma watched him work with an expression of wonder. They spent hours lost in creative collaboration, their heads bent together over Marcus's emerging designs. Emma would murmur an idea, and Marcus would incorporate it, refining and expanding until the vision took shape. The children's treehouse corner became a sculptural element with climbing holds and a raised platform. The cafe area curved organically, creating an intimate gathering space. Natural light would pour in from repositioned windows, and skylights would bring the changing sky directly into the space. What struck Marcus most profoundly was how naturally they worked together. There was no ego, no competition for whose idea was better. When Emma suggested something that wouldn't work structurally, he explained why gently, and together they found alternatives that pleased them both. When Marcus sketched something too cold or corporate, Emma softened it with her intuitive sense of warmth and community. They balanced each other perfectly. The bookstore owner sat back and looked at the drawings spread before them, her eyes glistening slightly. She reached over and squeezed Marcus's hand without speaking, and he understood what the gesture meant. This was more than a business expansion. This was a dream becoming tangible, and he was helping make it happen. Marcus thought about his old life in the city, the glass towers and minimalist aesthetics, the architectural competitions where he fought for recognition among thousands of other talented designers. He remembered the emptiness that came with success there, the way a completed project felt like an obligation crossed off a list rather than something meaningful. He thought about the years he spent creating spaces for corporations that could easily replace his designs with someone else's, where his contribution felt interchangeable and forgettable. But this was different. This was Emma's dream, born from her love for this community and her passion for books and connection. Marcus wasn't just designing a space. He was helping birth something that would hold memories, create experiences, and bring people together for years to come. Every line he drew, every detail he refined was infused with genuine purpose. As they drew plans together, Marcus realized that contributing to Emma's vision was more satisfying than any corporate project had ever been. Marcus had planned nothing elaborate, understanding now that the grandest gestures were often the quietest ones. The city had taught him the value of spectacle once, back when he believed that grand declarations required grand stages. But Emma had changed that understanding, slowly and gently, the way snow settles on a quiet landscape without anyone noticing the exact moment it began to fall. Valentine's Day arrived cold and gray, the kind of February morning where breath mists in the air and the village seemed to hold its breath. Marcus had closed the bookstore early, claiming inventory work, though really he'd only needed to arrange a few things and settle his racing heart. Emma had no idea what he'd planned, which was remarkable considering how small the village was and how little anyone could keep secret here. Perhaps it was because she never expected anything grand. Perhaps it was because love, real love, whispered rather than shouted. She arrived at 5:15, as she always did on Thursdays, wearing the cream-colored sweater he loved and carrying snowflakes in her hair. The bookstore glowed amber and warm, the way it always did in winter, but he'd added something special. Soft lights threaded through the shelves of romance novels and fresh flowers, pale pink roses that had taken considerable effort to procure from the city, sat on the worn wooden counter where they'd first truly talked. Emma's eyes widened as she stepped inside, and something in her expression told him she understood that today was different. Not different in the way people expected on Valentine's Day, with rigid formality and pressure, but different in the way that mattered. Different because it was theirs. He stood among the stacks where she'd taught him to appreciate the beauty of stories, where he'd learned that imagination and reality could coexist peacefully. This place had become sacred to him, not because of any architectural grandeur, but because it contained her dreams, and by extension, it now contained his too. Marcus reached for the small velvet box in his pocket, but he didn't pull it out immediately. Instead, he looked at her, really looked at her, the way he did now, with intention and presence rather than distraction. He saw the girl who had stayed in a small village when she could have chased bigger dreams elsewhere. He saw the woman who had helped him understand that home wasn't about location, but about finding someone who felt like coming back to yourself. He spoke quietly, his voice steady despite the trembling in his chest. He told her that he'd spent his whole life running towards something, believing that bigger always meant better, that ambition meant leaving rather than building. But she had shown him that the most meaningful life was built quietly, day by day, in the corners of small towns where people knew your name and remembered your coffee order. He spoke of how she transformed not just him, but his understanding of what mattered. How watching her passion for books and stories had reignited something in him he'd forgotten existed. How her dreams had become his dreams, not through sacrifice, but through genuine desire to create something beautiful together in this village they both loved. Only then did he remove the box and kneel among the shelves, surrounded by countless stories of love, knowing that theirs was the one he wanted to write with her. The ring was simple, elegant, genuine, exactly like Emma herself. He asked her to marry him not with elaborate words, but with a question that contained everything he felt. Emma's response came through tears and laughter, a yes that seemed to echo through the stacks of books. She pulled him up and he held her close, breathing in the familiar scent of her, the bookstore, and home. They stood together in the amber light, surrounded by stories both written and yet to be told. As Emma said yes through tears of joy, surrounded by the books and stories she loved, Marcus knew he had found his way home. The first signs of spring appeared not in leaves or flowers, but in the quality of light and the subtle shift in the wind. Marcus noticed it one morning as he stood at the edge of the village square, watching how the sunlight fell differently across the cobblestones. The golden hour seemed to linger longer now, stretching the days with increasing generosity. Winter had held everything in its crystalline grip for months, but now something was loosening, unfurling, beginning to breathe again. He had carried Emma's yes with him through January and into these early weeks of February like a secret treasure he wanted to tell the whole world about and keep entirely to himself. The ring sat in his jacket pocket most days, though Emma wore it openly now, the diamond catching light in that same transformed way the morning sun now caught the village itself. He found himself tracing its outline through the fabric sometimes, a small gesture of reassurance that it was real, that she was real, that this life they were building was genuine. The village was waking up in its own way. Mrs. Shen had begun preparing her garden beds, turning over the soil with practiced movements that spoke of decades of seasonal rhythm. The bookshop where Emma spent her days had reopened its upstairs reading room, the space that had been closed during the harshest months when heating felt like an extravagance. People lingered longer after leaving the coffee shop, choosing to walk home slowly rather than hurrying against the cold. There was a gentleness returning to the village's pace, a softening of the guardedness that winter imposed. Marcus had been offered a position at the small regional college, teaching literature and creative writing. The job would begin in the spring semester, just weeks away. He still couldn't quite believe it. After years of thinking he needed the anonymity and opportunity of the city, he found himself choosing this quiet place, choosing roots, choosing Emma and the life they imagined together. The irony wasn't lost on him. He'd spent so long running from small-town limitations that he hadn't recognized they were actually freedoms in disguise. The walk home from Emma's bookshop had become his favorite part of each day. Even in winter, he'd chosen to walk the long route, the one that curved through the quiet neighborhoods and past the small church where they would marry in early summer. Now, with the warming trend, the walks became almost meditative. His feet knew the path by heart. His mind began settling into the rhythm of the village heartbeat. One evening, as the sun dropped lower but warmer than it had in months, he stopped on the old bridge that crossed Millbrook Creek. The water ran clearer now, the snow melt from the higher elevations beginning its journey downward. He thought about how much could change in a year. A year ago, he was racing toward a deadline, toward success defined by metrics he didn't even believe in anymore. A year ago, he would have dismissed this village as provincial, limiting beneath him. Emma had taught him something essential without ever saying it directly. She had shown him that the smallest spaces could contain the largest loves, that a life rooted in one place, knowing neighbors by name and history, tending to the particular beauty of your own corner of the world, was not a consolation prize. It was everything. The light was changing faster now, lengthening noticeably week by week. Soon the branches would blush with color. The gardens would burst into wild celebration. The cafe would move its tables outside. The village would emerge from its winter slumber fully conscious and vibrant. But for now, in this threshold time between seasons, Marcus stood alone on the bridge and felt the particular grace of transition. He wasn't the man who had arrived in autumn, bruised and running. He wasn't yet the man he would become as summer approached and their wedding neared. He was something in between, something becoming, something opening like the season itself to new possibilities he could barely imagine. Marcus breathed the changing air and felt himself transforming in subtle ways, becoming someone new yet more authentically himself than ever before. March surrendered to April with a rush of green and the kind of birdsong that makes the heart remember why it beats. The village of Millbrook seemed to wake from a long sleep, stretching its limbs and shaking off the gray weight of winter. Marcus felt it too, this awakening, this sudden electricity that ran through the air and made everything seem possible and full of promise. The spring cleaning tradition had begun in earnest. Every corner of the village was being tended to with careful hands and hopeful hearts. Mrs. Chen stood in the town square directing the efforts, her small frame somehow commanding the attention of dozens of volunteers. Marcus found himself among them, paintbrush in hand, refreshing the weathered shutters of the community center. The paint was a crisp white that seemed to glow against the fresh green leaves unfurling overhead. As he worked, neighbors passed by with waves and genuine greetings. Old Tom stopped to comment on how Marcus had the perfect stroke, smooth and even. The Wilson twins, hardly teenagers now, asked if he needed help reaching the higher corners. There was no condescension in their offers, only the natural kindness of a community that had begun to see him as one of their own. This realization settled warm in his chest, warmer than the spring sun that beat down on his shoulders. Emma appeared just after noon with a basket of sandwiches and cold lemonade. She wore a simple cotton dress in pale yellow, and her hair was pulled back with a green ribbon that matched the new leaves. Marcus thought he had never seen anything quite so lovely. She smiled at him with that particular smile that had become familiar to him over these months, the one that suggested she knew his thoughts before he spoke them aloud. They sat together under the sprawling oak tree that anchored one corner of the square, and Emma told him about her plans for the garden behind her cottage. She described the flowers she wanted to plant, the vegetables that would thrive in the rich soil, the small bench she hoped to place where someone could sit and watch the world grow. As she spoke, Marcus realized he could envision exactly what she meant. He could see it as clearly as if it already existed. The afternoon brought more volunteers to the square. The entire village seemed energized by the season's turning. Children scrubbed the fountain until it sparkled. Men repaired the gazebo's railings. Women planted new flowers in the beds that lined the walkways. There was singing, laughter, the kind of cooperative joy that only comes when people choose to build something beautiful together. When evening arrived and the work was nearly complete, Marcus stood back with Emma to admire what they had accomplished. The community center gleamed. The square had been transformed. The village looked renewed, reborn into something vibrant and full of life. And Marcus realized that in helping to restore these spaces, he had restored something in himself as well. That evening, Emma took him to her cottage for the first time. The place was exactly as he had imagined it, filled with light and books and the gentle evidence of a life lived with intention and care. She showed him the small garden space behind the house, where the soil had been turned and prepared, waiting for seeds and for growth. They stood there as the sun painted the sky in shades of apricot and rose, and Emma took his hand without any self-consciousness or hesitation. She told him that spring had always been her favorite season because it reminded her that change was not something to fear. That transformation could be beautiful, that sometimes the things that seemed dead in winter were only sleeping, gathering strength for their renewal. He understood she was not only talking about gardens and flowers. They made plans then, careful plans that felt important and real. Plans to plant together, to tend the garden through the long, warm months ahead, to watch things grow and flourish under their shared attention and care. Hands in the earth, planting seeds with Emma for a summer garden, Marcus felt the literal and metaphorical truth of growth and renewal. The foundation for the bookstore expansion was laid in May, with the entire town seeming to gather for the modest celebration. What had begun as a quiet conversation between Marcus and Emma last autumn had blossomed into something far greater than either of them had anticipated. The architectural drawings that Marcus had spent countless evenings perfecting now existed in 3 dimensions, marked in chalk and string across the vacant lot adjacent to the bookstore. The morning was crisp and clear, the kind of May day that made you believe the earth itself was celebrating. Marcus stood at the edge of the construction site, his hands in his pockets, watching as the crew began their methodical work. Beside him stood Emma, her fingers briefly brushing his as she surveyed the marked boundaries with an expression of quiet wonder. This expansion represented more than just additional square footage for her beloved bookstore. It symbolized something neither of them had dared speak aloud until recently: the possibility of permanence. The townspeople had arrived with surprising enthusiasm. Martha from the post office brought homemade lemon bars. The Jenkins family, who owned the hardware store, came with thermoses of hot coffee. Even Robert, the town's most cynical resident, had shown up to observe the proceedings with what might charitably be called interest. They gathered on the perimeter, watching as Marcus reviewed the plans with the construction foreman, his architectural expertise evident in the precise way he gestured and explained each structural decision. Over the past months, Marcus had become increasingly visible in the daily rhythms of the village. He now worked 3 days a week at the bookstore, and his evenings were often spent either at Emma's cottage or back in the small studio space he'd rented above the coffee shop, where he continued to take on remote architectural projects. But the bookstore expansion had become his passion project, the one where he poured his heart rather than merely his professional skill. The design itself was a masterpiece of thoughtful integration. Rather than creating a jarring addition, Marcus had drawn inspiration from the village's architectural vernacular, using materials and proportions that complemented the existing stone structure. The new wing would house a reading room with expansive windows overlooking the gardens Emma had always dreamed of planting. There would be a small cafe area, a children's section complete with a cozy nook furnished with cushions and soft lighting, and a back room designated for community events and author readings. As the morning progressed, Marcus found himself explaining various aspects of the project to different villagers. He showed them how the foundation's depth would support the weight of the planned second floor. He walked them through the drainage systems designed to protect against spring flooding. He pointed out where the solar panels would go, making the expansion as self-sufficient as possible. With each explanation, Marcus felt something shifting inside himself. These weren't abstract architectural concepts anymore. Every decision he made would directly affect the lives of people he now considered friends. Emma watched him with an expression that made his chest tighten. She stood near the bookstore's entrance, occasionally glancing back at him with a smile that held both pride and tenderness. There was no pressure in that look, no expectation, just acknowledgement of the journey he was taking and the choice he was making to walk it within this community rather than away from it. By afternoon, as the foundation holes were dug and the concrete began to set, Marcus stood alone at the edge of the property. The sun was descending toward the western hills, painting the sky in shades of amber and rose. He thought about how different this moment felt from a year ago, when he'd arrived in this village running from something, searching for something undefined in the quiet spaces between buildings. The expansion would take the better part of a year to complete. By next autumn, the new wing would be finished, and the bookstore would have transformed into something greater than the sum of its parts. And Marcus, he realized, had already undergone his own expansion, extending himself into the fabric of this place and these relationships in ways he was only beginning to comprehend. Marcus watched the walls begin to rise, knowing that every brick represented a choice he had made, a life he was actively building rather than passively enduring. Wedding planning in Millbrook meant consulting with the community, gathering ideas and expertise from people who had celebrated countless marriages. Marcus and Emma discovered this truth on a crisp autumn afternoon when they announced their engagement at the village market. And within hours, conversations had begun blooming like wildflowers across the cobblestone streets. They sat together in the tea room on a Saturday morning, a notebook open between them, cradling warm cups of chamomile. Emma's hand rested on Marcus's arm, her smile carrying that particular lightness that came from planning something joyful together. The notebook was hardly necessary. Everyone had ideas. Mrs. Elena from the flower shop had already stopped by their cottage with sketches of autumn arrangements, deep burgundies and golden yellows mixed with white roses that would frame the village church entrance. Tom, who ran the bakery, had mentioned a 3-tier cake with honey and lavender, inspired by the local bees that Emma had come to adore. Even quiet Robert, who rarely spoke at gatherings, had whispered to Marcus about the stone archway near the old mill, a spot he claimed possessed perfect acoustics for exchanging vows. The beauty of planning in Millbrook was that nothing felt like an obligation. Suggestions arrived wrapped in genuine enthusiasm rather than expectation. When Marcus asked about a small reception space, he learned that the community center could be transformed into something elegant with just a few careful touches. The same hands that built his walls, that welcomed him into their homes, that taught him the rhythms of village life, now wanted to help him celebrate this milestone. Emma had spent weeks thinking about what mattered most, not the Instagram perfect details that dominated bridal magazines, but rather the feeling she wanted their day to carry. She wanted their ceremony to reflect the quiet contentment they had discovered together, the way love felt less like lightning and more like coming home. She wanted the faces of people who had become family surrounding them as they made their promises. They decided on an evening ceremony in late spring, when the lilacs would be blooming and the light would linger long into the hours traditionally meant for darkness. This would be a wedding that honored both their stories, the city lives they had left behind and the village existence they had chosen. Marcus's brother would come from the city, bringing news of that former world. Emma's parents would arrive days early, eager to understand the place that had transformed their daughter. The guest list naturally capped itself at just under 100, not because of budget constraints, but because that was the size of their true community. The baker and his wife, the woman who ran the library, the teenagers who worked at the shop, the farmers and teachers and retired couples who formed the actual backbone of their daily lives. Each invitation felt like an extension of a conversation already begun. What struck Marcus most was how planning this wedding never felt like stress. There was none of the frenetic energy he remembered from friends orchestrating elaborate city events. No vendor drama, no family politics spiraling into chaos. Instead, there was a gentle collaboration, as if the village was helping them build something that belonged to all of them. Emma designed their invitations herself, watercolor paintings of the mill and the church and the hills beyond, each one slightly different like snowflakes. They spent evenings addressing envelopes in comfortable silence, occasionally pausing to laugh at a particularly enthusiastic note from a villager suggesting ideas. Marcus found himself thinking often about the walls being built around his property. Each brick had represented a choice, a commitment to staying, to building, to becoming part of something real. This wedding was another brick in that same structure. It was a public declaration that he belonged here, that Emma belonged here, that their love was woven into the actual fabric of Millbrook rather than existing in spite of it. As lists grew and plans solidified, Marcus felt not overwhelmed but supported by Emma, by the village, and by the genuine momentum of a life built on truth. June arrived with days that seemed endless, filled with golden light and the smell of flowers blooming in every garden. Marcus walked through Millbrook with a lightness in his step that hadn't existed before, a buoyancy born from months of honest living and genuine connection. The village had transformed once again, shedding its spring freshness for something more abundant and generous. The farmers' market expanded to twice weekly, spilling across the entire town square with vendors offering strawberries still warm from the sun, bundles of fresh herbs tied with twine, and honey in glass jars that caught the afternoon light like liquid amber. Marcus had begun volunteering at the local community garden, a half-acre plot tucked behind the library where tomato plants climbed their stakes and zucchini sprawled across the earth in wild profusion. His hands, once soft from years behind a desk in the city, had grown calloused and capable. There was something profoundly grounding about kneeling in the soil, watering seedlings that would feed families in the village, knowing that his work mattered in immediate and tangible ways. Emma often met him there on Saturday mornings, her presence making even the most mundane tasks feel like adventures. They would work side by side, sometimes in comfortable silence, sometimes talking about everything and nothing. She showed him how to identify which weeds truly threaten the plants and which ones could coexist peacefully. She taught him the particular satisfaction of knowing that the salad greens growing under his care would end up on someone's dinner table within days, not weeks. Their relationship had deepened beyond the excitement of new love into something steadier and more sustaining, like the slow warming of earth as summer deepened. The village calendar filled with celebrations that pulled everyone outdoors. There was the 4th of July parade, a modest but spirited affair where the high school marching band played slightly off-key renditions of patriotic songs and children waved flags from the parade route. Marcus found himself volunteering to help with the fireworks display, standing alongside Jack from the hardware store and several other community members, learning the careful choreography of safety protocols and timing. When darkness fell and the first burst of color exploded across the sky, Marcus felt Emma's hand slip into his, and he understood that these moments of simple joy, shared with people you cared about, were what made life actually worth living. Throughout June and July, there were community dinners in the town square, long tables stretched under strings of lights as dusk fell. The smell of grilled corn and barbecue drifted through warm air, and neighbors brought casseroles and salads and elaborate desserts that were set out on a side table groaning with abundance. Musicians played guitar and fiddle on the bandstand, and locals danced with the kind of unself-conscious joy that only came from deep familiarity. Marcus had danced with Emma under those lights, her head tilted back with laughter, and he had felt something shift inside him, a final settling of his heart into this place and these people. The summer rhythms became his rhythms. He knew which coffee shop opened earliest, where to buy the best peaches, which hiking trails were most beautiful at dawn. He recognized faces everywhere, called people by name, and was called by name in return. Mrs. Chen at the library saved books she thought he'd enjoy. The postmaster commented on his packages with genuine interest. He was woven into the fabric of this place, no longer a newcomer but someone who belonged. As August began its slow fade into autumn and he worked in the garden at evening time, watching the sun take longer to set each night, Marcus found his thoughts turning backward. He thought of last autumn when he had first arrived in Millbrook, fleeing a life that hadn't fit, searching for something he couldn't quite name. He thought of the weight he'd carried then, the exhaustion of pretending, the loneliness of distance from authentic connection. He thought of how this year had unfolded like one of the flowers in the garden beds, each petal revealing itself in its own time until the whole bloom was visible. Marcus realized he had lived through a complete cycle of seasons in Millbrook, and rather than dreading the return of winter, he found himself looking forward to it. Summer brought a festival nearly every weekend: concerts on the lawn, farmers markets, craft fairs, and celebrations that anchored Millbrook's social calendar. Marcus moved through these events with a different energy than he had carried just months before. Where once he had observed from the periphery, maintaining the comfortable distance of an outsider, he now found himself woven into the very fabric of the planning and execution. It began simply enough in early June when a leaner mentioned that the summer concert series needed volunteers to help coordinate logistics. Marcus heard himself volunteering before his old instincts could pull him back into isolation. The first meeting took place in the community center, around a long wooden table surrounded by neighbors whose faces had become familiar. There was genuine enthusiasm in the room, a collaborative spirit that made him understand how communities actually functioned, not through grand gestures, but through countless small commitments made by ordinary people who cared. The July Farmers Market became his particular focus. Marcus worked with Thomas, who managed the local agricultural cooperative, to ensure vendors had adequate table space and that the flow of foot traffic remained manageable. They walked the village square together at dawn, marking positions with chalk, discussing sight lines and accessibility. Thomas shared stories about how the market had grown over the years, and Marcus listened with real interest, asking questions that showed he was genuinely invested in Millbrook's success rather than merely passing time. There was something profoundly satisfying about the tangible results of collaborative effort. When the market opened and everything functioned smoothly, when families moved comfortably between vendors and children picked out fresh berries with their parents, Marcus felt a quiet pride that had nothing to do with personal achievement. The satisfaction came from being part of something larger than himself, from knowing that his contributions mattered to people he had come to care about. The craft fair in mid-July introduced him to another dimension of community engagement. He helped a leaner organize the artisan booths, which meant coordinating with craftspeople from surrounding towns. Alina worked with infectious energy, and Marcus found her enthusiasm contagious. They spent an entire afternoon arranging tables and discussing the layout, occasionally pausing to drink lemonade and laugh about small logistical challenges. Alina seemed pleased to have him there, not as her romantic interest in that moment, but as a genuine partner in the work. They had settled into an easier rhythm together, the pressure of undefined feelings replaced by authentic partnership. As August arrived, Marcus had become known among the organizers as someone reliable and thoughtful. When problems arose, a vendor canceling last minute, sound equipment malfunctioning, unexpected weather requiring contingency plans, people turned to him naturally. He had developed instincts about the community's needs and habits. He understood which residents preferred quieter events and which loved the excitement of large gatherings. He knew which children needed clear safety boundaries and which vendors required special accommodations. The August concert series climaxed with a larger event, a celebration of local music featuring several bands from the region. Marcus found himself managing the stage setup, coordinating with musicians, troubleshooting sound issues, and ensuring that the seating areas were comfortable and accessible. Alina worked beside him, their movements synchronizing through unspoken understanding developed over weeks of collaboration. When the music began and the village square filled with residents enjoying an evening under the stars, Marcus understood that he had become part of the mechanism that made these moments possible. Working behind the scenes revealed dimensions of Millbrook he had never noticed as an outsider. He saw the careful attention to detail that made events feel effortless. He witnessed the quiet conversations where longtime residents made decisions about community resources and direction. He experienced the deep satisfaction of seeing his work contribute to genuine joy and connection among people he now considered friends. The realization crept up gradually, rather than arriving as a sudden epiphany. As Marcus helped set up for another event, he noticed he was doing so automatically, without thinking, the sign of someone who truly belongs. When the young architect drove to Millbrook to meet Marcus, She didn't know she was seeking wisdom from someone who had learned it through lived experience rather than textbooks. Her name was Sarah, and she had graduated from a prestigious university with all the right credentials and all the familiar doubts that come with them. She had found Marcus's name through a colleague who mentioned his work rehabilitating old structures in rural areas, and his philosophy about building with communities rather than for them. She arrived on a gray afternoon in early spring, when the village was just beginning to wake from its winter slumber, and the first green shoots were pushing through the thawing earth. Marcus met her at the small coffee shop where Alina worked, the same place where his own transformation had begun years ago. He recognized something in Sarah's careful posture and the way her eyes scanned the room, assessing, measuring, comparing. He had been like that once, before Millbrook had taught him that sometimes the most important measurements couldn't be taken with instruments. They talked for hours, and Sarah pulled out her portfolio with the nervous energy of someone presenting not just her work, but her worth. Her designs were technically sound, intellectually rigorous, and somehow empty of something essential. Marcus didn't criticize. Instead, he asked questions. He asked about the people who would inhabit her spaces. He asked whether she had sat in silence in the buildings she designed, whether she understood how light moved through them at different hours, whether she had spoken to the people who would use them about their dreams. Sarah's pencil paused above her notebook. She admitted she hadn't done any of those things. There had been too many projects, too tight schedules, too much pressure to deliver what clients specified rather than what communities needed. Marcus found himself speaking with an authority he hadn't known he possessed. He described how Alina had taught him that small gestures held tremendous power, how Alina had shown him that attention was the highest form of respect. He talked about the renovation project he had completed last year, where he had spent 3 months simply observing, listening, and understanding before drawing a single line. The building that emerged wasn't groundbreaking in its architecture, but it had become the heart of its community because it reflected genuine care for the people it would serve. He walked Sarah through Millbrook, showing her the projects he'd worked on, not as monuments to his skill, but as conversations frozen in wood and stone. Here, a wider doorway created by the architect's friendship with an elderly resident. There, a community garden space positioned to catch afternoon light, designed after Marcus learned that gardening was how this particular neighborhood processed grief and hope. Everywhere, the marks of attentiveness rather than assumption. Sarah asked how he had learned to think this way, and Marcus had to pause. He thought of his own journey, the year of seasons that had brought him from isolation to belonging. He thought of how arriving in Millbrook had felt like arrival in a foreign country, and how he had gradually learned the language of genuine community. He told her that sustainable design wasn't really about materials or energy efficiency or climate resilience, though those things mattered. It was about designing spaces where people could become fully themselves, where their histories and hopes could be held, where they could actually live rather than simply exist. That kind of sustainability came from understanding that a building was only successful if it made the people within it feel known. As they stood at the edge of the village green, watching the community move through its evening routines, Sarah asked Marcus if he would mentor her. She wanted to learn this language too. She was ready to slow down, she said. She was ready to let communities teach her before she taught them through her designs. Marcus accepted with genuine humility, understanding that teaching required him to articulate what he had learned not from books or professors, but from a year of transformation in a place that had become home. As Marcus discussed design and community with genuine passion, he realized he had become someone whose experience and perspective others valued. With 2 weeks until the wedding, Marcus sat down to write a letter to the anxious, resistant version of himself who had arrived in Millbrook a year ago. The autumn light filtered through the cottage windows, casting long shadows across his desk, and he found himself searching for words that could somehow bridge the vast distance between who he had been and who he had become. "Dear Marcus," he began, his pen moving slowly across the cream-colored paper. "I'm writing to you from a place you probably can't imagine right now. You're standing in a village you didn't want to visit, in a life that feels like punishment rather than possibility. Your shoulders are tense, your jaw is clenched, you're already planning your escape route, already calculating how quickly you can return to what you believe matters. I understand. I was you just days ago in this strange version of time we've learned to navigate together. But I need you to know that everything you're about to experience, every awkward dinner, every moment of genuine laughter you'll try to suppress, every conversation that actually makes you think beyond quarterly reports and portfolio growth, these moments will quietly reshape you. You won't notice it happening. You'll resist it. You'll convince yourself that this place is temporary, that these connections are superficial, that Emma is lovely but ultimately a distraction from your real life. You'll be wrong about all of it. The man you become doesn't abandon ambition. He simply learns that ambition without purpose is like a river without banks, flowing in every direction and nourishing nothing. You'll discover that the things you build matter most when they're built with people who matter to you. You'll learn that legacy isn't measured in square footage or corner offices, but in the number of lives you've genuinely touched, the genuine moments you've truly shared. This woman, Emma, she's going to teach you things no mentor ever could. She'll show you that being seen completely, flaws and all, is not weakness but courage. She'll demonstrate daily that love is both fierce and gentle, both fiercely protective and gently forgiving. You'll watch her move through this village with such authentic presence that you'll suddenly understand why presence matters more than performance. She won't demand that you change. She'll simply love you in a way that makes you want to become someone worthy of that love. The cottage you'll live in, the quiet mornings you'll spend with her, the evening conversations with people whose names you don't yet know, the way the entire community will somehow know your coffee order. All of this will feel like home in a way your penthouse never did. And that won't make you weak. It will make you complete. I know you're afraid. You're afraid that settling down here means settling for less. You're afraid that choosing a small town means small dreams. You're afraid that loving someone this much means losing yourself. But the truth is stranger and more beautiful than your fears allow. You don't lose yourself here. You finally find yourself. You become the person you were meant to be all along, before ambition got in the way. The year ahead won't be simple. You'll have moments of doubt. You'll question your decisions. You'll miss the energy of the city. But then you'll hold Emma's hand and you'll feel something settle in your chest, and you'll know you've made the right choice. You'll realize that the success you've been chasing your entire life was actually waiting for you here, in this place you never wanted to come, with this woman you never expected to love, building a life that actually matters. So trust the process, even when it's uncomfortable. Open yourself to possibilities you never considered. Listen to Emma when she speaks. Pay attention to the quiet moments. They're where the real transformation happens. And in 2 weeks, as you stand at the altar of the little stone chapel on the village green, you'll look at her face and know that you've already succeeded in the most important endeavor of your life. The man you'll become is worthy of her love. I promise you that. He sealed the letter, knowing he would read it years from now and remember the exact moment he chose authenticity over ambition, love over legacy. Emma had a glow about her in the days before the wedding, not the frantic energy of a bride managing a production, but the serene joy of someone certain about her choice. She moved through the village with an unhurried grace, stopping to chat with Mrs. Patterson at the bakery about the autumn wildflower arrangements, exchanging warm embraces with the librarian who had become a dear friend, pausing to admire the way the late afternoon light filtered through the maples lining Main Street. There was no anxiety etched into her features, no second-guessing that flickered behind her eyes. She had come home to the rolling hills and winding country roads a year ago carrying fragments of a broken heart, and she was leaving this chapel as a wife bound to the man who had helped her gather those pieces and make them whole. In the small cottage that served as her dressing room on the wedding morning, Emma sat before a mirror in her grandmother's dress, an ivory lace creation that had been carefully preserved in tissue paper for decades. Her mother fastened pearl earrings to her ears with trembling hands, tears of happiness streaming down her face. Emma reached up and squeezed her mother's wrist, a gesture of understanding passing between them. Her mother had watched her daughter struggle through the painful months in the city, had seen her return to this small place broken and searching, and had witnessed the quiet magic of finding home again, not just in geography, but in another person. The dress fit as though it had been waiting for this moment, as though her grandmother's love had been stitched directly into the seams. Emma ran her fingers along the delicate lace, feeling the weight of continuity, the blessing of women who had loved before her, who had walked this same path of commitment and courage. She thought of Marcus, of his quiet steadiness during those early months when she was still learning to trust again, still learning that vulnerability could be a strength rather than a weakness. Down the hall, Marcus sat in a small room adjacent to the chapel, reading the letter he had written to his younger self. The boy who believed success meant climbing, always climbing, measuring worth in quarterly reports and corner offices and the admiration of people he barely knew. He folded the letter carefully and placed it in his jacket pocket, close to his heart. In a few moments, he would walk into that chapel and see Emma, and he wanted to carry the memory of his own journey with him. He wanted to remember how lost he had been, how certain she had been, even when doubt had nearly consumed him. The chapel was filled with sunlight the color of honey, and every pew held faces that had become important in the course of a single year. The librarian and the baker, neighbors and shop owners, people whose names Marcus had learned, and whose stories had taught him that a life well lived was not measured in acquisitions, but in connections. The village pastor stood at the altar, waiting, and when Emma appeared in the doorway, there was a collective intake of breath. She looked like autumn itself, warm and golden and full of gentle transformation. Marcus could not look away. Years from now, when they were sitting on the porch of whatever home they built together, when children perhaps played in their yard, when the seasons had cycled through countless times, he would remember this moment with crystalline clarity. He would remember the way her eyes found his across the chapel, the way her smile contained all the promises they had already made and all the promises yet to come. He would remember that she had chosen him, not once but continuously, through doubt and fear and the quiet work of building something real. The ceremony unfolded with simple beauty, their vows exchanged in steady voices, hands clasped together as if they had been made to fit precisely this way. As the sun began its descent toward the distant hills, painting the chapel windows in shades of amber and rose, Marcus found himself overwhelmed with gratitude so profound, it nearly took his breath away. That night, holding her close in the darkness of their hotel room, Marcus kissed Emma gently and whispered, "Thank you for believing in us before I did." August arrived with a morning so clear and perfect it seemed the weather itself was celebrating. Marcus woke in the guest room of the cottage where he'd spent the night, following tradition, and found sunlight streaming through the lace curtains in pale golden streams. He lay still for a moment, breathing deeply, feeling the weight and lightness of this day all at once. His heart moved steadily in his chest, not racing with anxiety, but humming with a quiet certainty that had taken him a full year to develop. The village was already stirring. He could hear the distant sound of the church bells being tested, a warm bronze tone that seemed to echo across the rolling hills. Through the window, he saw the stone church perched on its gentle rise, and beyond it, the patchwork of autumn gold fields that stretched toward the horizon. Emma was somewhere in this landscape now, in her mother's house, preparing. The thought of her made him smile. He dressed slowly and deliberately, tending to each small ritual with care. His brother had arrived 3 days ago from the city, along with a handful of friends from his old life, and they were gathering downstairs now. Their voices carried up the stairs, warm and familiar, people who had watched him transform over these 12 months. They'd been skeptical at first about the small-town love story, the man who abandoned ambition for a woman and a place. But they'd come, and they'd fallen under the spell of this village too. That mattered somehow. The weather held as the morning progressed. Marcus made his way through the familiar streets toward the church, his brother beside him, both of them dressed in charcoal suits with wildflower boutonnieres that Mrs. Chen from the flower shop had arranged with her particular magic. The village seemed to pause as he walked. People waved from doorways and storefronts. Old Tom from the post office called out a blessing. The school teacher smiled with genuine warmth. Inside the church, the space was transformed by Emma's vision. Wildflowers and greenery hung from every beam, and the afternoon light flooded through the stained glass windows, casting colors across the stone floor like a benediction. There were 200 people seated in the pews, a mix of Emma's lifelong community and his newly adopted one, plus his guests from the city who sat with curious expressions, as if seeing something they didn't quite have names for. Marcus stood at the altar with his brother, watching the space fill with people whose faces had become essential to him. Emma's father took his place. The organist, Mrs. Wright, moved her fingers across the keys, and the familiar opening notes of Pachelbel's canon filled the vaulted space. The entire congregation rose as one, and then she appeared at the end of the aisle. Emma moved toward him in a dress of ivory silk that seemed to glow in the light, her dark hair adorned with the wildflowers they'd gathered together from the meadow near the stone bridge. Her face held that particular radiance that comes when a person is completely present, completely certain, completely loved. Their eyes met and held as she walked, and Marcus felt something shift and settle inside him simultaneously. This moment contained everything. It held the morning he'd walked into her bookshop, uncertain and untethered. It held every conversation in the library, every evening walk, every discovery of who he was becoming in this place. It held the resistance he'd overcome and the expectations he'd released. It held his brother's skepticism transformed into joy, his friend's surprise at finding magic in a small village, his own heart's slow awakening to the possibility of belonging. Emma reached him, and her father placed her hand in Marcus's palm. That contact, skin to skin, seemed to speak in a language beyond words. The vicar began the ceremony, but Marcus heard only the essence of the words, the intention underneath them. He was here. She was here. This village had called them both home. Standing at the altar in the small stone church, watching Emma walk toward him, Marcus felt the intersection of all his journeys, past, present, and future, converging into this single, perfect moment. Marcus's voice was steady as he spoke vows that had been forged in the crucible of his own reluctant transformation. The small stone church was filled with soft autumn light, filtering through windows that had witnessed 100 years of promises. 200 people sat in reverent silence, but Marcus saw only Emma, her eyes glistening as she stood across from him, radiant in the dress she had chosen months ago when she still hoped, when she still believed in him even when he did not believe in himself. "I came to Millbrook thinking I was running from something," Marcus began, his voice clear and unhurried. "I thought I was escaping the noise, the expectations, the relentless pace of a life that never felt like mine. What I didn't understand then was that I was actually running toward something. Toward you, though I didn't know it yet." He paused, gathering the weight of everything those words meant. The journey had been long, the resistance real, the transformation genuine. "Emma, I stood in this village for months with my walls intact, convinced that love was a luxury I couldn't afford, a vulnerability I couldn't risk. I watched you work at the library, I heard you laugh at the farmer's market. I felt your kindness radiating outward into every corner of this town, and I built defenses against it all. Not because you weren't worthy of my heart, but because I wasn't sure I knew how to give it." A tear traced down Emma's cheek, and Marcus's voice grew softer, more intimate. "But you were patient with me. You showed me through quiet moments what it meant to belong to a place and to a person. You never demanded that I change, yet you somehow made me want to become someone better. Someone capable of loving you the way you deserved to be loved. You taught me that home isn't about running away from anything. It's about running towards someone over and over again, choosing them in small moments and large ones." He took a breath, and the autumn light seemed to settle around them like a benediction. "I promise to honor the man I was before you, the confusion and fear that brought me here, because without those struggles, I wouldn't appreciate this clarity now. I promise to show up, not just in the grand gestures, but in the ordinary Tuesday mornings when we make coffee together, in the Saturday afternoons when we tend the garden, in the quiet evenings when we sit together without needing to speak. I promise to be honest with you, even when honesty is difficult, especially when it is difficult. His hand reached out and Emma took it, their fingers intertwining like a continuation of his vows. I promise to build a life here with you that honors both who we are and who we are becoming together. I promise to cherish this village that held space for my transformation, to be part of this community that has become my home, not because I was running anymore, but because I choose it every single day. I promise to protect this love we have built, not with walls, but with intention, with presence, with the same courage it took me to finally let those walls down. Marcus's eyes were wet now, his voice thick with emotion that had been earned through months of surrender and discovery. You asked me once why I came here, and I didn't have an answer. But I know now. I came here to find you. I came here to find myself. I came here to learn that these two things were never separate, that loving you was the same as loving the person I could become. Thank you for waiting. Thank you for believing in me when I couldn't believe in myself. Thank you for being the home I didn't know I was searching for. The vicar stepped forward with the ring, a simple band of gold that caught the afternoon light and seemed to glow with its own quiet radiance. As he placed the ring on Emma's finger, Marcus whispered a promise not just to her, but to the man he had become, to honor this life, to nurture this love, to cherish this home. As the sun set on their wedding day, Millbrook came alive with music and laughter, the kind of celebration that only small towns seem to understand. The reception had transformed the village green into something magical, with strings of warm lights crisscrossing overhead like captured stars brought down to earth. Long tables laden with food stretched across the grass, and the old gazebo had been converted into a stage where the local band tuned their instruments with practiced ease. Marcus stood beside Emma, watching as their community gathered around them. He could hardly believe this was real, that he was here, that he had chosen this life and this life had chosen him back. Emma squeezed his hand, her white dress catching the golden light of the setting sun, and he marveled at how she seemed to glow from within, radiant not just with happiness but with belonging. The music started softly, a gentle waltz that drew them toward the center of the green. As they moved together, the villagers formed a circle around them, clapping in rhythm. Marcus recognized faces he now knew as intimately as his own reflection. There was old Tom, who had taught him everything about the village's history. Sarah from the bakery had made their wedding cake herself. The Hendersons, who ran the general store, were beaming with pride as if they had orchestrated the entire romance themselves. As the song progressed, the tempo shifted. The fiddles grew brighter, the drums more insistent, and suddenly the entire village seemed to pour onto the grass to dance. Children spun in circles around their parents' feet. The elderly couples swayed together with the kind of practiced ease that came from decades of movement in sync. Young people laughed and twirled, their joy infectious and pure. Marcus found himself dancing with nearly everyone in Millbrook that evening. Emma's father took him aside to tell him that his daughter had never been happier, his eyes growing misty as he spoke. Emma's mother embraced him with genuine warmth, no longer the cautious woman who had first met this city boy, but a mother welcoming a true son into her heart. Even the village children, normally shy around him, pulled him into games of dancing and laughter, their small hands tugging at his sleeves. The night deepened and the stars began to emerge overhead, spreading across the black velvet sky like diamonds scattered by an unseen hand. Someone brought out more food, more drinks, and the celebration never seemed to lose its energy. Instead, it transformed, becoming slower and more intimate as the evening wore on. The band played softer songs now, their melodies carrying notes of bittersweet joy and profound contentment. Emma found him again as the night reached its deepest hour. They moved together slowly, barely dancing anymore but simply holding each other as the music played around them. He could smell the jasmine from her hair, could feel the steady beat of her heart against his chest. A year ago, he had been a stranger in this place, a man running from something without knowing what he was running toward. He had been hollow, drifting, disconnected from any sense of purpose or place. Now, standing in the middle of a village that had become his own, with a woman who had remade his understanding of what love could be, Marcus felt the full weight of his transformation. This wasn't just a celebration of their union. It was a celebration of his arrival, his acceptance, his choice to stop running and start living. Every person dancing around them represented a thread that bound him to this place, to this life, to this version of himself that he was still discovering. The stars multiplied overhead, growing brighter as the earthly lights around them dimmed. The band played on, and the village moved like one great organism, celebrating two people who had found each other in the most unexpected of ways. Marcus looked down at Emma's face, illuminated by starlight and happiness, and felt something settle deep within him, something that felt like permanence and peace. Dancing with Emma as the stars emerged and the village danced around them, Marcus felt completely, utterly home. The small cabin where they spent their honeymoon week was beautiful, but Marcus found himself counting the days until they returned to their cottage in Millbrook. This realization surprised him. The cabin sat perched on a mountainside with views that stretched for miles, all rolling forests and misty valleys that changed color with each passing hour. The honeymoon had been everything a honeymoon should be. Romantic dinners prepared in a kitchen that smelled of fresh herbs and possibility, long mornings wrapped in soft blankets, afternoons spent exploring nearby trails where the autumn light filtered through golden leaves like liquid honey. Emma noticed his distraction on the fourth day. They were sitting on the cabin's broad porch, wrapped in a quilted blanket despite the mild temperature, watching the sun paint the distant mountains in shades of rose and amber. She leaned her head against his shoulder and asked him softly what he was thinking about. Marcus hesitated. He didn't want to hurt her feelings or seem ungrateful for this beautiful space, this beautiful time. But Emma had always known him deeply, had learned to read the subtle shifts in his expression and the particular quality of his silences. So he told her the truth. He missed Millbrook. He missed their cottage with its creaking floorboards and mismatched shelves full of books they'd collected together. He missed the way Main Street sounded on a Tuesday morning when Mrs. Chen opened her bookstore and called out greetings to passing neighbors. He missed the ritual of stopping at the bakery for coffee, of knowing exactly which table would be occupied by which regular, of being part of something larger than himself. Emma smiled at this confession, and her smile contained neither judgment nor disappointment. Instead, she looked at him with profound tenderness, as though she had been waiting for him to arrive at this moment, and she was grateful he had finally gotten there. They spent the remaining days of their honeymoon more mindfully, both of them aware they were experiencing something fleeting and precious. They took photographs by the cabin's stone fireplace. They made love slowly and deliberately. They read books aloud to each other in voices that grew softer as evening deepened. They talked about the future and what returning home meant now that they were married, bound together in ways both legal and spiritual. On their final evening, they drove to a nearby town and found a small restaurant where they ordered wine and shared a table by a window overlooking a quiet street. Marcus watched Emma's face as she spoke about her hopes for their life together in Millbrook. She wanted to expand her bookstore eventually. She talked about adopting a dog, perhaps a rescue from the shelter in the next county over. She spoke of the possibility of children sometime in the future, of teaching them to climb the hills surrounding the village, of raising them in a place where community mattered and people looked out for one another. All of it sounded beautiful. All of it sounded like home. The drive back took several hours. They traded off driving duties, and when Marcus took the wheel for the final stretch, he found his heart quickening as the landscape became familiar. The rolling hills took on characteristics he recognized. The trees began to look like old friends. The sky itself seemed to shift slightly, as though welcoming them back. As they crested the final hill and Millbrook came into view below them, Marcus felt something settle in his chest. The village looked exactly as it always had, small and modest and unassuming. The church steeple rose above the surrounding buildings. Smoke drifted from chimneys as residents prepared their homes for the coming winter. Autumn had progressed in their absence, and the trees now burned in deeper shades of amber and red. This was his home. This place he had once been so desperate to escape from now felt like the answer to a question he'd been asking his entire life. The transformation had been gradual, measured in quiet conversations and shared moments, and the slow opening of his heart to possibility. Driving back into the village, Marcus squeezed Emma's hand, a gesture that meant, "I'm home," and he meant it with every fiber of his being. The second autumn arrived in Millbrook with colors that seemed even more spectacular than the year before, or perhaps they simply meant more now. Marcus walked through the village with his eyes lifted toward the canopy of maples that lined Main Street. The same trees that had seemed quaint and provincial 12 months ago now felt like old friends, their transformation a mirror of his own. Where once he had seen change as merely seasonal, now he understood it as a form of grace, a gentle reminder that transformation was not just possible but inevitable and beautiful. He thought back to that first October when he had arrived exhausted and lost, his tailored suits feeling like armor rather than comfort. The city had promised him everything and delivered only emptiness. Success had tasted like ash. He remembered standing at the edge of the village green that inaugural autumn, wondering what cosmic joke had brought him to this place of gentle rhythms and uncomplicated lives. Now, walking those same streets with Emma beside him, Marcus felt the weight of that question dissolve into something far more profound. The answer had not come all at once, but had accumulated like fallen leaves, layer upon layer of small moments building into understanding. There was the morning he had helped old Mr. Patterson fix the fence without expecting anything in return. There was the afternoon Emma had taught him to bake apple pie from her grandmother's recipe, flour dusting her hair while she laughed at his clumsy folding technique. There was the night he had sat on the porch of his small house, listening to nothing but the wind and the crickets, and realized that silence was not empty but full of possibility. The year had unfolded in seasons. Winter had brought unexpected tenderness when he had shoveled snow for elderly residents simply because their driveways needed clearing. Spring had arrived with the opening of the community bookstore where Emma worked, her dream made manifest, and Marcus had discovered that supporting someone else's vision could fill his own heart in ways success never had. Summer had heated the days with festival planning, helping to organize the harvest market, feeling genuinely needed in ways his old career had never provided. Now autumn circled back, completing the wheel. But Marcus was not the same person returning to the same place. He was fundamentally altered, remade by intention and by love. The maple leaves did not remind him of what he had lost, but rather of what he had discovered existed all along beneath the surface of his frantic striving. Emma squeezed his hand as they paused beneath a particularly magnificent tree, its branches ablaze with gold and crimson. She did not need to speak. Over the past year, they had learned to communicate in glances and silences, in the comfortable space between words where true understanding lives. She had never tried to change him or to diminish his ambitions. Instead, she had simply shown him that ambition could take many forms, that success could mean helping to build something meaningful in a community that had welcomed him home. The October breeze carried the scent of wood smoke and cinnamon, and somewhere in the distance, he could hear children laughing in the schoolyard. These sounds had once felt foreign, belonging to a world too simple for someone of his accomplishments. Now they sounded like belonging, like the comfortable noise of a life being lived fully rather than merely accumulated. Marcus thought about the man he had been, always reaching for the next thing, convinced that happiness lived in some distant future when the goals were finally met. He thought about the desperation that had driven him into that beautiful valley 12 months ago, broken and searching without knowing what he sought. Emma rested her head on his shoulder as they continued walking, their pace deliberately slow, savoring the afternoon light as it filtered through the changing leaves. There would be winter again, and spring and summer and another autumn. The seasons would continue their patient cycle, and Marcus would meet each one with the knowledge that home was not a destination, but a state of becoming. Standing with Emma, watching the leaves turn gold and crimson, Marcus realized that coming home isn't always about returning to a place. Sometimes it's about becoming the person who knows where home truly is. The ribbon cut at the bookstore expansion revealed a space that was unmistakably Emma's vision, but uniquely enhanced by Marcus's understanding of how space shapes human experience. The autumn morning light streamed through the new glass walls Marcus had designed, tall windows that framed the surrounding hills like living paintings. Emma stood beside him, her fingers interlaced with his, and her eyes glistened as she took in what had grown from whispered conversations and shared dreams during quiet evenings over the past year. The original bookstore remained exactly as it had been, its worn wooden shelves and creaking floorboards preserved like treasured artifacts. But now it flowed seamlessly into an expansion that somehow felt like it had always been meant to exist there. Marcus had created arched doorways that invited exploration without overwhelming, and the new section rose with cathedral-like proportions that made readers instinctively lower their voices to reverent whispers. Emma had chosen the color palette for the walls, soft warm creams and gentle sage greens that seemed to absorb the light rather than reflect it. But Marcus had taken her vision further. He understood that space wasn't just about aesthetics. It was about how bodies moved through it, how light landed at different hours, how the architecture itself could whisper encouragement to tired souls seeking solace between pages. He had designed the new shelving units with subtle angles that created intimate alcoves, each one positioned to catch natural light at different times of day. A reader sitting in the corner during morning would bathe in golden rays, while evening visitors would find themselves in softer, diffused light that somehow made reading feel like wrapping oneself in a warm blanket. The grand opening drew nearly everyone in the small village. Mrs. Patterson, who had spent countless hours here over her 73 years, stood near the original counter with tears streaming down her weathered face. Young families wandered the expanded children's section, where Marcus had built a reading loft with cushioned seating and a gentle ramp instead of harsh stairs. The local teenagers discovered a quiet corner Marcus had created specifically for them, with comfortable seating arranged in a way that didn't feel institutional, but rather like a secret hideaway. Emma moved through the space like a conductor, performing a symphony she had composed. She showed people where Marcus had installed hidden shelving along the sloped walls, where books could be displayed without feeling cramped. She pointed out the reading nook he had positioned beside the window facing east, where morning light would dance across a reader's pages. The cafe area that Emma had envisioned now occupied a portion of the expansion, where the aroma of brewing coffee mingled with the unmistakable scent of aged paper and leather bindings. Marcus watched as the community embraced what they had created together. This bookstore had become more than a repository for stories. It was a sanctuary where the boundaries between Emma's emotional intuition and Marcus's spatial intelligence merged into something neither could have accomplished alone. The expansion wasn't just architectural. It was a physical manifestation of how two people from different worlds had learned to build something beautiful in the space between them. An elderly man approached Marcus, studying the room with obvious appreciation. "You know," the man said, "I grew up here, moved to the city for 40 years, and came back because I realized nothing out there was as real as what we had here. Your design makes me feel like maybe that was the right choice." Marcus nodded, understanding that this man had asked his own version of the question that had drawn Marcus home. Emma squeezed his hand, and he turned to find her looking at him with an expression of such tender pride that it took his breath away. She had known, somehow, that Marcus would eventually understand that architecture was never really about buildings. It was about creating spaces where people could become more authentically themselves, where the stories they carried inside could find rest and expression. The afternoon wore on, and the bookstore filled with the gentle murmur of conversation, the soft rustling of pages being turned, the quiet clink of ceramic cups. As customers filled both the original and expanded spaces, Marcus felt the profound satisfaction of having created something that would bring joy to his community for years to come. The approach of winter no longer filled Marcus with apprehension, but with the cozy anticipation of long nights with Emma, projects to work on, and the intimate rhythm of a small town in its quietest season. He stood in the cottage's main room on a crisp November afternoon, watching dust motes dance in the golden sunlight streaming through the windows. The air carried that particular quality that comes only in late autumn, a gentle coolness that promised the deeper cold ahead but still held traces of the year's lingering warmth. Emma found him there, her arms full of fabric samples and paint swatches. She smiled, that same smile that had transformed his entire understanding of what home could mean. She had been spending more time at the cottage lately, leaving small traces of herself everywhere. A book on the nightstand, a favorite tea in the kitchen cupboard, the way she had rearranged the living room furniture to create a conversation area by the fireplace. Together they spread their treasures across the old wooden table, a piece of furniture that had come with the house and now seemed integral to their planning sessions. They had been saving for this moment, this gentle reimagining of their shared space. The cottage was already perfect in its bones, but they dreamed of making it undeniably theirs, a sanctuary that reflected both of their sensibilities. Marcus traced his finger along a warm top paint color. They were thinking of the bedroom, a place where they wanted everything soft and enveloping. Emma leaned against his shoulder, considering. She pointed to a slightly deeper shade, and when he looked at it beside the first, he understood immediately. It was like watching a photograph come into focus. The project list had grown organically over the autumn weeks. New shelving in the kitchen nook, where Emma wanted to display her growing collection of ceramic vessels and local pottery. A reading window seat in the small study, built to capture the winter light. Fresh tile in the bathroom, and most ambitiously, they were planning to restore the old stone fireplace, uncovering the craftsmanship of whoever had built this cottage 50 years ago. Marcus thought back to his arrival in Millbrook just over a year ago, how he had driven through this village seeking nothing but escape from the relentless pace of the city. He had imagined himself as a temporary resident, someone passing through. The cottage had seemed like a temporary shelter, a place to hide while he figured out what came next. Yet somewhere in the turning of months and the gentle accumulation of small moments, temporary had become permanent, and he could no longer imagine living anywhere else. Emma spread out photographs she had collected of design inspiration, images that spoke to their shared sensibility without them having to articulate it. Warm wood, natural light, space for quiet mornings and intimate evenings. She had also brought sketches, rough drawings of furniture arrangement and potential layouts. They were not architects or designers, just two people learning to build a life together, but there was something beautiful in their careful consideration of every element. As evening approached and the light began its early descent, they moved their planning session to the kitchen. Emma made tea while Marcus built a fire, following the routine they had developed. The cottage filled with warmth and the gentle scent of wood smoke and chamomile. They sat by the growing flames, wrapped in quilts, talking about timing and priorities. They discussed which projects they would tackle first, which could wait until spring. There was no urgency, no deadline pressing them forward except the gentle rhythm of seasons. Winter would give them time for the smaller projects, the detailed work. Spring would bring the larger renovations. And in between, they would simply live here, gradually making the space more fully their own. Marcus thought about the bakery, flourishing with its expanded space, and about Emma's growing confidence in her work there. He thought about their families, who had slowly come to accept and celebrate this improbable relationship that had bloomed in a small town neither of them had planned to stay in. Planning the next phase of their life together, Marcus and Emma were already anticipating the beauty and rest that winter would bring. The architect Marcus had become was different from the one who had reluctantly driven to Millbrook. Slower, deeper, more thoughtful, more connected. He sat on the wooden bench outside the community center on an early autumn afternoon, watching the leaves begin their gentle transformation. The air held that particular quality of change, crisp and promise-filled, and he breathed it in with genuine gratitude. 12 months had passed since he first arrived in this small village, bitter and burned out, convinced that his worth was measured in skyscrapers and portfolio accolades. Now watching Mrs. Chen arrange fall chrysanthemums at the market stall across the square, he felt something settle in his chest, a quiet satisfaction that no penthouse view had ever provided. The renovations he had worked on this year told a different story than his previous career. There was the elementary school library, where he had spent hours with the children, understanding how light needed to fall across reading corners to invite young minds into stories. The community garden structure, designed with his hands and the hands of volunteer carpenters, where vegetables grew and neighbors grew closer. The cottage where he and Emma were planning their future, restored with careful attention to its original character rather than trendy minimalism. These spaces held soul. They held the fingerprints of community involvement, the laughter of people he knew by name, the knowledge that his work would serve generations of people he would actually watch grow and change. He thought about Emma and how she had reflected this transformation back to him. She had seen something in him worth saving even when he couldn't see it himself. Her quiet wisdom, her commitment to meaningful work in the school, her way of finding beauty in simple rituals. These things had taught him more about authentic living than any business school or architectural seminar ever could. Their love had become not a distraction from success, but a foundation for genuine happiness. Marcus pulled out his phone and scrolled through the photographs he had accumulated over the year. Here was the village in spring mist, when he and Emma had walked the hill paths and talked about their dreams. Summer brought images of him teaching local teenagers sustainable design principles in workshops, watching their eyes light up as they understood how buildings could heal rather than harm. There were pictures of community dinners, of architectural sketches done in coffee shops with real people who cared about their town's future, of quiet mornings in his studio apartment before it became their cottage. The old Marcus would have dismissed all of this as provincial, beneath his talents and ambitions. That Marcus measured his life in square footage of projects completed and prominence of clients served. He had confused prestige with purpose, mistaking the addiction of achievement for genuine fulfillment. But somewhere in these 12 months of seasons, of small conversations and meaningful work, of choosing to show up for people who showed up for him, something fundamental had shifted. He no longer felt the constant hum of anxiety, the sense that he needed to prove something to invisible judges. His phone did not buzz with urgent demands from distant superiors. His value was not contingent on the next big deal. Instead, he had discovered something revolutionary in its simplicity: the profound peace of being known and valued for who he actually was. Not for what he could build, but for how he treated people. Not for the prestige of his address, but for his presence at the table. Not for accumulation, but for contribution. The architect he had become designed spaces with his community, not for a resume. He mentored young people who might have otherwise left the village seeking opportunity elsewhere. He had helped restore historical buildings that held the memory and meaning of this place. His work now served the people he loved and the place he had chosen to call home. As the autumn sun began its descent, painting the square in amber light, Marcus understood that success looked entirely different now. It was Emma's hand in his. It was the mayor asking for his advice on the town square renewal. It was being able to walk down Main Street and know not just names, but stories, dreams, struggles, and hopes. He wasn't the same person anymore, and he wouldn't want to be, because the journey had transformed him into someone he genuinely liked and respected. Marcus wrote letters to his friends in the city, not to convince them of his choices, but to share the truth of his happiness. The autumn afternoon cast golden light across his small kitchen as he sat at the wooden table, pen in hand, paper before him. A cup of cooling tea steamed gently beside the stack of envelopes. Outside his window, the leaves were turning that same shade of amber and crimson that had first drawn him to this place a year ago. The seasons had circled back upon themselves, and he had circled back to himself in ways he never anticipated. He thought of James first, his oldest friend from the marketing firm, who had questioned his decision with the skepticism of someone who measured success in promotions and six-figure salaries. Marcus wrote to him about the satisfaction of knowing his neighbors by name, of participating in community decisions that actually mattered, of having time to read entire books instead of skimming articles during lunch breaks. He didn't expect James to understand immediately, but he wrote honestly nonetheless. He described how his mornings no longer began with that familiar knot of anxiety in his stomach, how his work felt connected to real people rather than abstract markets. Then he wrote to Sarah, who had warned him that small towns were suffocating, that he would regret leaving behind the cultural institutions and endless opportunities. He told her about the small library where he volunteered now, about the community theater production he had attended last month where the acting was imperfect but the heart was genuine. He wrote about discovering that fulfillment came not from checking boxes on some predetermined life trajectory, but from genuine engagement with the people and places around him. To Jennifer, who had simply asked if he was running away, he wrote the most carefully. He acknowledged that perhaps initially there had been some escape in his decision, some desire to step away from what wasn't working. But he explained how he had discovered the difference between running from something and running towards something. He had come here to find Alina, yes, but he had stayed because he had found himself. The distinction mattered enormously, and he wanted her to know that he understood the question wasn't accusatory but born of care. Each letter contained genuine moments from his new life. He wrote about his work at the local nonprofit, about how a project to improve the town's water infrastructure had kept him engaged for weeks, how solving real problems for real people felt revolutionary compared to optimizing digital advertising campaigns. He wrote about Alina, not with the intensity of new love, but with the settled contentment of partnership. He described her laugh, which he still loved after months of hearing it regularly, how she had taught him to bake bread, how they spent quiet evenings reading together. He wrote about the volunteers he had met, the teenagers he mentored, the elderly widow he helped with her garden beds each spring. He wrote about belonging in ways that the city, for all its vastness and possibility, had never quite allowed him to experience. In cities, you could be anonymous. Here you were known, you were expected, you mattered in tangible daily ways. What struck him most as he wrote was his own lack of defensiveness. A year ago, he would have crafted these same letters as justifications, as arguments to prove his decision correct. Now he simply shared his experience, trusting it to speak for itself. He didn't need their agreement. He had stopped performing his contentment and started living it. Some letters, he knew, would be met with understanding and genuine joy for him. Others would receive polite responses tinged with concern, as if he had made some peculiar choice they could not quite process. A few might go unanswered, his friends perhaps unable to reconcile this version of Marcus with the ambitious man they had known. The thought no longer troubled him as it once would have. He sealed the letters knowing that some would understand and some wouldn't, and that his peace didn't depend on anyone else's comprehension of his journey. The future stretched before Marcus and Emma, with the promise and potential that comes from building a life together in a place you genuinely love. They sat on the front porch of their farmhouse as autumn returned to the village, exactly 1 year from when Marcus had first driven down the dusty road leading to this place. The air carried that particular crispness that made you want to breathe deeply, to fill your lungs with the certainty of changing seasons. Emma leaned against him, her fingers intertwined with his, and they watched the trees begin their slow transformation into gold and crimson. The question had emerged naturally over the past few weeks, rising up in quiet conversations and lingering glances. What came next? They had survived a year of renovations and reconnections, of discovering that small towns held their own kind of magic. That community wasn't something you observed from a distance, but something you lived within, breath by breath. Marcus traced gentle circles on Emma's palm as he spoke. He told her about the conversations he'd been having with the local school board, about the possibility of developing a literacy program in the evenings, something that could help adults who'd never quite caught up, who felt shame about reading in public. Emma listened the way she always did, with her full attention, understanding that this wasn't just about him offering something to others, but about him continuing to become who he was meant to be. Emma shared her own dreams then. She talked about the community garden expanding, about teaching teenagers and young adults the skill of growing their own food, of reconnecting with the earth in ways that the city had never allowed. She spoke of workshops in their barn come springtime, of preservation and conservation, and the quiet satisfaction of working with your hands to create something that would nourish others through the winter months. The conversation drifted toward the bigger questions then, the ones that couples wrestle with in the gathering darkness. Children, the word hung between them like a question mark made of hope and uncertainty. Neither of them had rushed to answer, had felt the need to decide immediately. They had learned over this extraordinary year that time moved differently here. Things unfolded at their own pace. Decisions didn't need to be made from urgency, but could emerge from genuine knowing. Marcus spoke about wanting a child or two someday in this house they'd rebuilt together. He imagined teaching a son or daughter to read in the library they'd created from the bones of the old farmhouse, imagined watching them run through the fields that surrounded them. But he also spoke of not needing to rush toward it, of being content in this season of just the two of them, building something solid and true. Emma's eyes grew misty as she listened. She admitted her own fears about motherhood, her own desires for it, the complicated feelings that women sometimes don't speak aloud. But beside Marcus, in this village where people actually knew their neighbors' names and stopped to chat at the market, where children played safely in green spaces, the idea felt less frightening and more like a natural extension of the life they were creating. They talked about the farmhouse too, about the rooms that still needed work, about the possibility of hosting gatherings there, of opening their doors to the community that had opened its arms to them. They dreamed of holiday celebrations in the newly restored dining room, of book club meetings in the library, of quiet dinners with friends who had become family. As the sun descended lower and the sky blushed pink and purple, they sat in comfortable silence, not needing to fill every moment with words. The plans they'd discussed weren't firm commitments, but rather possibilities, threads they could weave into the tapestry of their lives whenever they felt called to do so. This was what they'd learned from returning to a small town, from slowing down, from really listening to each other and to themselves. The future didn't need to be rushed or perfected or planned down to every detail. It only needed to be faced together, with open hearts and genuine commitment to building something beautiful. Whatever came next, children, more community projects, deeper roots, would be something they would create together, on their own terms, in their own time. 2 years after driving into Millbrook with resistance and doubt, Marcus sat on the cottage porch watching the seasons change with the peace of someone who has found his way. The autumn air carried that particular sweetness he had come to recognize, the smell of earth preparing for rest, of apples ripening in nearby orchards, of wood smoke curling from chimneys throughout the village. His hands wrapped around a mug of tea that had gone nearly cool, and he didn't mind. Time moved differently here. It moved with intention. He thought back to that first arrival, remembered the tight grip he'd had on the steering wheel, the way his jaw had clenched as he'd driven past the general store, past the white church with its modest steeple, past the coffee shop where he would eventually spend countless mornings. He had come here running from something. Now he understood he had been running toward something all along, though his mind hadn't caught up with his heart's navigation. Elena emerged through the cottage door with her own mug, settling into the wicker chair beside him without needing words. This was one of the 1,000 small intimacies he had learned to treasure, the comfortable silence, the easy presence of someone who knew you completely. She had been instrumental in his transformation, though she would never claim credit for it. She simply loved him into wholeness, the way the sun loves the earth, without fanfare or expectation of return. The cottage they had made together was warm now, filled with the artifacts of a shared life. The kitchen held her grandmother's recipes on faded cards. The bookshelves displayed both his architecture books and her poetry collections, their spines touching like hands. The bedroom still smelled faintly of lavender from sachets she had sewn. Every corner bore witness to the slow alchemy of two people becoming a unit, yet remaining brilliantly themselves. His work in Millbrook had evolved too. The architectural projects he undertook now were rooted in genuine care for the community. The community center renovation had become his meditation, his daily prayer of gratitude. Walking its halls, he saw Alina teaching children to sew, saw the teenagers gathered in the space he had designed for them, saw elderly residents playing cards where there had once been only dust and abandonment. Each beam he had restored, each window he had installed, carried his commitment to staying. The people of Millbrook had transformed from strangers to a constellation of dear ones. Mrs. Patterson still brought casseroles, though now they were celebratory rather than pitying. Tom from the hardware store had become a genuine friend, someone whose opinion Marcus actually sought. The book club had become sacred time. Even young Sarah, who had seemed so lost when he first arrived, was thriving now, accepted into the university architecture program where she would study next year. He realized that belonging wasn't something that happened to you. It was something you chose repeatedly in 1,000 small moments. It was choosing to show up at the town meeting even when you were tired. It was choosing to help repair Mrs. Patterson's fence on a Saturday morning. It was choosing Alina again and again in the quiet of morning and the vulnerability of night. It was choosing to be known, to let people see the raw edges where he had been broken, and finding that they loved him not despite those fractures, but because of the light that now shone through them. The sun was beginning its descent, painting the hills in shades of amber and rose. Winter would come again soon, as it always did, and Marcus welcomed it. He would welcome spring after that, and summer and autumn again. The cycle was no longer something he resisted, but something he moved with, understanding that human hearts, like seasons, required their own rhythms of dormancy and bloom, of darkness and light. Alina reached over and took his hand, and he brought it to his lips, kissing her knuckles with the tenderness of someone who still couldn't quite believe his good fortune. Home, he had learned, wasn't the place you started from or the destination you were driving toward. It was the choice to stay, to build, to love, and to let yourself be transformed by the ordinary magic of connecting deeply with people and place.